The golden hues of an early autumn afternoon bathed the quiet streets of Oakwood, a small neighborhood nestled in the heart of a town that seemed to hold time in a gentle embrace. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves and distant chimney smoke, while the trees whispered secrets to one another in the soft breeze. For 13-year-old David Johnson, this was more than just a walk, it was a ritual, a journey through a place that felt like an extension of his soul. His sneakers crunched against the carpet of amber and crimson leaves scattered across the sidewalk, each step a small symphony of sound that mingled with the tune he hummed under his breath. It was an old melody, one his grandmother used to sing to him when he was small, her voice a warm blanket that wrapped around him even now, years later. Today, like so many days before, he was on his way to her house, a sanctuary of love and safety, where the world made sense and troubles melted away. With the promise of her famous sugar spice cookies, David was no ordinary boy, though he'd never admitted himself. In a town where everyone knew everyone, he stood out not for arrogance or flash, but for the quiet brilliance that shone in his dark eyes, and the kindness he offered without hesitation. At school, his teachers marveled at his sharp mind, always quick with an answer yet never boastful. On the streets, neighbors smiled at the sight of him, the boy who'd stop to help carry groceries or listen patiently to an old man's rambling tales. His heart was light, unburdened by the weight of his father's new role as the town's chief of police. Marcus Johnson was a towering figure in the community, a man whose presence commanded respect and carried the heavy mantle of responsibility. But to David, he was just Dad, steady, strong, and the one who'd taught him that justice wasn't just a word, but a way of living. That afternoon, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the familiar rows of houses, David felt a flicker of unease ripple through his peace. At first, it was nothing more than a stray thought, easily dismissed, caught sight of two figures in the distance behind him. They wore the unmistakable navy blue of police uniforms, their badges glinting faintly in the sunlight. Oakwood was a safe place, after all. Seeing officers on patrol wasn't unusual. Maybe they were just keeping an eye on things, ensuring the calm that blanketed the neighborhood stayed unbroken. David shook his head, chuckling softly at himself for being so jumpy. He was overthinking it. He was just a kid, heading to his grandmother's house with nothing but good intentions in his heart. What could possibly go wrong? But as he rounded a corner, the unease crept back, sharper this time, like a splinter under his skin. He stole a quick glance over his shoulder, and his breath caught in his throat. The two officers weren't just walking, they were following him. Their steps were deliberate, measured, closing the gap between them with an almost predatory rhythm. Officer Grant led the pair, a man whose sharp, steely eyes seemed to pierce through anything they landed on. His face was etched with lines of stern authority, a permanent scowl that suggested he'd seen too much and trusted too little. Beside him was Officer Baker, younger and less hardened, his posture stiff but his expression uncertain, as if he were caught in a current he didn't fully understand. David's pulse quickened, a drumbeat of nerves pounding in his chest. He turned his head forward again, trying to focus on the path ahead, but the weight of their stares bore down on him, cold and unyielding. His mind raced, tumbling over itself in a frantic search for reason. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just walking, hands in his pockets, lost in thoughts of his grandmother's warm kitchen. He knew police officer's father was one, the best one, a man who'd spent countless evenings at the dinner table, explaining how the law was meant to protect, not intimidate. But this didn't feel like protection. This felt like something else. Something dark and unfamiliar that twisted his stomach into knots. He tried to shake it off, to tell himself he was imagining things. But the sound of their boots against the pavement grew louder, closer, an insistent echo that drowned out the rustling leaves and the song in his head. David's fingers twitched as he reached into his pocket, fumbling for his phone. His hands trembled not from the chill in the air, but from the growing certainty that something was terribly wrong. He dialed his father's number, the screen blurring slightly as his shaky thumb pressed the keys. When Marcus's voice came through, calm and deep as always, it was like a lifeline tossed into a stormy sea. "Hello," his father said, and David could hear the faint rustle of papers in the background. the hum of the precinct buzzing faintly behind him. "Dad," David whispered, his voice barely audible, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile thread of composure he clung to. "There are 2 officers following me. They're acting weird. I don't know what's going on." The words spilled out in a rush, tinged with a fear he couldn't hide. On the other end of the line, Marcus Johnson froze. His son's voice, usually so steady and full of quiet confidence, was trembling now, laced with a vulnerability that struck him like a physical blow. David didn't call for no reason. Something was wrong, deeply, viscerally wrong. The chief's heart sank, a cold dread pooling in his chest as he shoved aside the stack of reports on his desk. "Where are you?" he demanded, his tone shifting from fatherly warmth to the clipped urgency of a man who'd faced crises before. David murmured his location, and Marcus was already moving, snatching his keys from the desk and bolting for the door. His boots thudded against the precinct floor, each step fueled by a mix of fury and terror. This wasn't about his title or his badge. This was about his son, his boy, caught in a situation that made no sense. Back on the street, David's legs moved faster now, though he fought to keep his pace steady, not wanting to give the officers any reason to escalate whatever this was. The distance to his grandmother's house stretched out before him, the familiar landmarks: Carter's rose bushes, the crooked mailbox on Elm Street, warped into something alien under the shadow of his growing panic. The officers were closer, their presence a suffocating pressure at his back. He could almost feel Officer Grant's icy gaze drilling into him, relentless and accusing, while Baker's footsteps lagged just slightly, as if the younger man were wrestling with some unspoken doubt. David's mind churned with questions, each one more frantic than the last. Why were they following him? What could they possibly think he'd done? He was just a kid, a good kid, the kind who'd never so much as jaywalked. His father's lessons echoed in his head: stay calm, speak clearly, don't let fear take over. But those words felt distant now, drowned out by the thudding of his own heart. He glanced back again, and this time there was no denying it. Grant's face was set in a hard line, his eyes locked on David with an intensity that made his blood run cold. Baker's expression was softer, conflicted, his brow furrowed as if he wanted to say something but couldn't find the courage. The street was silent save for the sound of their pursuit, the neighborhood's usual warmth replaced by a tension that hung heavy in the air. David's grandmother's house loomed ahead, its white porch and flower boxes a beacon of safety that felt impossibly far away. He clutched his phone tighter, his father's voice still ringing in his ears. "I'm on my way, David. Stay calm." But calm was slipping through his fingers like sand, replaced by a gnawing dread that whatever was coming, he couldn't stop it. Then, cutting through the stillness like a blade, Officer Grant's voice rang out, rough and commanding. "Hey, stop right there." The words cracked the air, sharp and unyielding, freezing David mid-step. His breath hitched, his body tensing as he turned slowly to face them, his heart hammering so loudly he was sure they could hear it. In that moment, the lessons of justice his father had drilled into him collided with the raw, unfiltered reality unfolding before him, a reality where power could twist into something cruel, where innocence could be ignored, and where the consequences of prejudice could leave scars too deep to heal. For Marcus, racing through the streets in his patrol car, the world had narrowed to a single, desperate mission: reach his son. For David, standing frozen under the weight of those cold, accusing eyes, the journey ahead would be one of truth, trust, and a hard-won hope that even the smallest actions could spark a change worth fighting for. David's entire body went rigid, his heart slamming against his ribcage as if it were trying to break free. The moment had arrived, the one he'd dreaded. In the pit of his stomach was cornered, hemmed in by the unyielding presence of the officers. Their stern faces loomed like shadows cast by a storm cloud, and there was no escaping their piercing scrutiny. He turned around slowly, each movement deliberate, as though he could delay the inevitable. His mind churned wildly, a chaotic whirl of thoughts scrambling for a way out. "I'm just going to my grandmother's house," he managed to say, forcing the words past the lump in his throat. He willed his voice to stay steady, but it trembled at the edges, betraying the tremor that shook every fiber of his being. "It's just up the street," he added, clinging to the simplicity of the truth as if it could shield him. But Officer Grant wasn't having it. His eyes narrowed into slits, suspicion hardening his gaze into something cold and unforgiving. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. The question wasn't just an inquiry, it was an accusation, sharp and jagged, meant to wound. "You don't look like you belong in this neighborhood," he sneered, each word dripping with disdain. The statement hit David like a physical blow, knocking the breath from his lungs. What did that even mean? Oakwood wasn't just some place he passed through, it was woven into the fabric of his life. Every weekend of his childhood had unfolded here, racing through the yards with the wind in his hair, pedaling his bike down cracked sidewalks, sitting at his grandmother's worn kitchen table with a plate of warm cookies in front of him. This was his home, his sanctuary. Yet, in that moment, Officer Grant's words shrank him down to nothing, stripping away his sense of belonging until he felt like a stranger trespassing on his own memories. "I live here," David replied, planting his feet more firmly against the pavement. His voice was soft, barely above a whisper, but there was a quiet defiance in it, a spark of resistance against the weight pressing down on him. "I'm just visiting my grandma." The officers exchanged a glance, a silent conversation passing between them in the flicker of their eyes. It was clear they didn't believe him, or perhaps they didn't want to. Their minds were already made up, cemented long before he'd opened his mouth. To them, he wasn't a teenage boy with a destination. He was a problem, a figure to be questioned, a potential danger lurking in their pristine vision of Oakwood. The realization sank into David's chest like a stone, heavy and cold. No matter how earnestly he spoke, no matter how true his words, they had cast him as the villain in a story he hadn't written. The interrogation escalated quickly, a barrage of demands that left him gasping for air. "What's in your pockets?" Officer Grant barked, stepping closer, his towering frame eclipsing the faint streetlight behind him. "Why are you here? What are you hiding?" The questions came like gunfire, relentless and disorienting, giving David no space to gather his thoughts. His throat tightened as he swallowed hard, his hands trembling as they brushed against the small box tucked in his pocket. It was nothing sinister, just a gift, a simple scarf he'd picked out for his grandmother after saving up for weeks. He'd imagined her face lighting up when she opened it, her wrinkled hands smoothing the fabric with pride. But now, that innocent token felt like a liability. His fingers hesitated over it, reluctant to surrender this piece of his heart to their judgment. Before he could decide, Officer Grant's hand shot forward, plunging into David's pocket and yanking the box free. He shook it in the air triumphantly, as if it were evidence of some grand crime. "What's this?" he snapped, his tone thick with mockery. "A gift for your grandma?" The way he said it, dripping with incredulity, twisted David's gesture of love into something absurd, something suspicious. David's face burned, a searing mix of anger and shame flooding through him. "It's just a scarf," he said, his voice quivering but resolute. "For my grandma." He locked eyes with Grant for a fleeting second, willing him to see the truth. But the officers didn't flinch. They didn't care. To them, the scarf wasn't a gift, it was a prop in their narrative of guilt. They'd already decided he didn't belong, that his presence in Oakwood was a violation of some unspoken rule. The weight of their assumptions pressed down on him, threatening to crush the last shred of his dignity. David felt his resolve fraying, his spirit buckling under the relentless scrutiny. He wanted to scream, to demand they explain why his every move was a crime in their eyes. But the words stayed trapped in his throat, suffocated by fear. Just as the tension reached a breaking point, the air split with the shrill screech of tires. A black car jolted to a stop at the corner, its headlights slicing through the dusk like a beacon. The door flew open and out stepped Chief Marcus Johnson, his broad shoulders squared with authority, his face etched with a fury that seemed to radiate from him in waves. The officers spun around, caught off guard by the sudden intrusion. Marcus strode toward them with purpose, his boots striking the pavement in a rhythm that echoed like a war drum. "What's going on here?" His voice was a blatticold, precise, and unyielding, cutting through the thick haze of hostility. Officer Grant faltered, his bravado crumbling under the weight of his superior's presence. "Sir, we thought he was acting suspicious," he stammered, the words tumbling out in a rush. Marcus's eyes blazed, a storm brewing behind their calm surface. "Suspicious," he repeated, his tone deceptively even, but the anger beneath it crackled like static. "This is my son. He's visiting his grandmother. Do you have any idea what you're doing?" The officers froze, the gravity of their mistake crashing over them like a tidal wave. Marcus stepped closer, his imposing figure dwarfing them both. "You assumed he was a threat without asking a single question," he said, his voice low but laced with a righteous indignation that made the air hum. "Is this how you treat the kids in this neighborhood? Would you do this to your own children?" The question hung there, heavy and accusing, stripping away their excuses. Officer Grant shifted on his feet, his gaze dropping to the ground, unable to meet the chief's piercing stare. Beside him, Officer Baker would been a silent shadow until knuckled, his jaw tight with unease. His hands fidgeted at his sides, betraying the guilt gnawing at him. He'd stood by, complicit in the injustice, and now the weight of that choice bore down on him. Marcus drew a slow, steadying breath, his chest rising and falling as he reined in his temper. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but carried the unshakable force of a man who'd seen too much. "From now on, you will treat every person here with respect." This was a mistake, a big one. David stood rooted to the spot, a flood of relief washing over him, mingling with a fierce pride that swelled in his chest. His father had stepped into the fray, a towering shield against the officer's baseless accusations. The suffocating tension that had gripped him began to loosen its hold. Replaced by a fragile but growing sense of justice, the officers nodded mutely, their earlier confidence reduced to ash. Without another word, Marcus placed a firm hand on David's shoulder. "Let's go home, son," he said, his tone softening into something warm and paternal, a balm after the storm. As they turned to walk away, David felt the steady pressure of his father's hand, both a comfort and an anchor amidst the chaos. Swirling in his mind, the walk away from the scene was surreal, the world tilting slightly off its axis. Relief coursed through David, but it was fleeting, chased by the lingering sting of the officer's stares boring into his back. Their suspicion clung to the air like smoke, a bitter reminder that wouldn't dissipate. He glanced up at his father, searching his face for answers. Marcus's anger had faded, his features softening into something more contemplative. But there was a shadow in his eyes, a quiet disappointment that cut deeper than rage. David knew it wasn't directed at him. His father wasn't just shaken by what had happened today. He was wrestling with the ugly truth that this wasn't an isolated incident. Oakwood, the community Marcus had sworn to protect as police chief, had failed his own son. For years, he'd worn the badge with pride, believing he could shape a force that served justice fairly. But now, seeing his officers' men he'd trained on David with such blind prejudice, Marcus felt the foundation of his convictions tremble. David's voice broke the silence, small and tentative. "What happens now?" he asked, almost afraid of the answer. Marcus looked down at him, his eyes softening with a tenderness that clashed with the turmoil simmering beneath. He wanted to offer reassurance, to promise that everything would be okay. But the words wouldn't come. The truth was, he didn't know. He'd spent decades in law enforcement, rising to chief with a vision of order and fairness. Yet here he was, powerless to erase the hurt etched into his son's face. "We'll talk about this when we get home," he said finally, his voice steady but heavy with unspoken thoughts. "Right now, let's just get you to Grandma's. She's probably worried sick." David nodded, but the response felt hollow. His mind was still trapped in that momentary one where Officer Grant's voice had sliced through him, declaring he didn't belong. It stung like an open wound, a cruel reminder that the streets he'd roamed his whole life could turn hostile in an instant. All because of how he looked. The walk to his grandmother's house stretched on, each step heavier than the last. The familiar houses lining the street where he'd played tag with friends, helped neighbors carry groceries, laughed until his sides ached felt different now. The warmth of Oakwood had dimmed, its comforting embrace replaced by a subtle chill that seeped into his bones. Something fundamental had shifted, though he couldn't quite name it. The neighborhood he'd always known, the one that had shaped him, seemed to whisper a new truth. Belonging wasn't a given, not even here. By the time they reached the little house on the corner, The golden glow spilling from its windows felt like a lifeline. David could hear his grandmother's soft humming drifting through the screen door, a melody as familiar as his own heartbeat. For a fleeting second, it was as if nothing had changed. But as they stepped inside, the air carried a charge, a quiet tension that belied the homely scene. Evelyn Johnson looked up from the kitchen counter, her hands dusted with flour, a wooden spoon poised over a mixing bowl. Her face broke into a radiant smile at the sight of David, her eyes crinkling with the kind of love that had always made him feel whole. "There's my boy," she said warmly, her voice a soothing balm. But then her gaze flickered to Marcus, and the smile faltered, giving way to a flicker of concern. She set the spoon down slowly, wiping her hands on her apron as she studied her son's face. "Everything okay?" she asked, her tone gentle but laced with a mother's intuition. She could sense the storm they'd walked in with, the weight of it hanging between them like a dark cloud. David stood there, caught between the comfort of her presence and the raw ache of the day, knowing that the lesson he'd learned a day about justice, power, and the cost of wielding it carelessly would stay with him long after the warmth of her kitchen faded. In the quiet warmth of the Johnson family kitchen, David's chest tightened as he gazed at his grandmother, Evelyn. Her presence had always been a soothing balm, a constant in his life that softened even the sharpest edges of pain. She was the one who could mend a scraped knee with a hug or chase away a nightmare with a gentle word, her hands always busy with some small act of care. Today, though, those hands moved with a heaviness David hadn't seen before, kneading dough with a deliberate slowness that betrayed the storm brewing beneath her calm exterior. The familiar scent of rising bread filled the air, mingling with the soft hum of the refrigerator, but it couldn't mask the tension that hung over the room like a thick fog. Marcus, David's father, stood by the counter, his broad shoulders slumped under an invisible weight. He didn't want to trouble Evelyn. God knows she'd carried enough burdens in her long life. But the truth gnawed at him, demanding to be shared. With a voice roughened by exhaustion, he began to recount the day's events, his words spilling out haltingly at first, then gaining momentum. He painted a vivid picture, the sun dipping low over Oakwood's cracked streets. As he and David walked home, the air thick with the scent of pine and dust, the sudden appearance of the officers, their badges glinting like cold steel under the fading light, the way their eyes narrowed, their voices sharpened with suspicion as they trailed David, a boy who'd done nothing but exist in the wrong place at the wrong time. Marcus's hands clenched into fists as he spoke, his knuckles whitening as he relived the helplessness of watching his son shrink under that unprovoked scrutiny. Evelyn listened, her face a canvas of shifting emotions, concern deepening the lines around her eyes, anger flickering in the tight press of her lips. She'd lived in Oakwood since she was a girl, her roots tangled deep in its soil. She knew its winding roads, its weathered homes, its proud history whispered through generations. But she also knew its shadows, unspoken divides, the quiet resentments that simmered beneath the surface, the challenges no one dared confront head-on. Oakwood was a town of beauty and memory, yes, but it was also a place where justice often wore a crooked mask, where power could twist into something ugly and oppressive. As Marcus's story unfolded, she felt a pang of recognition, a bitter taste of the past rising in her throat. This wasn't new, it was a thread in the town's fabric, woven tighter with every passing year. "You can't let this slide, Marcus," she said at last, her voice cutting through the heavy silence like a blade. It wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of a woman who'd seen too much to stay quiet. Evelyn had a way of speaking that pinned you in place, her words firm yet laced with a quiet strength that demanded attention. "This isn't just about David. It's about Oakwood, about the way things have festered here for decades. You've got to act." Her eyes locked onto Marcus's, searching, urging him to see what she saw, a town teetering on the edge of its own reckoning. Marcus let out a long, shuddering breath, his hand drifting to the back of his neck, rubbing at the tension coiled there. He knew she was right. Evelyn always had a knack for cutting through the noise to the heart of things. This wasn't just about one frightening encounter, it was about something bigger, something that pulsed beneath Oakwood's surface like a living thing. He'd noticed it over the years, the sit-along glances between neighbors, the way certain streets grew quiet when the wrong person walked through, the prejudices that clung to the town like damp rot. Those officers who'd shadowed David weren't outliers, they were symptoms, mirrors reflecting a system that had lost its way, a system that wielded power carelessly and left scars in its wake. The lesson was clear: justice wasn't guaranteed, and unchecked authority could corrode even the tightest-knit community. David slid into a chair at the kitchen table, his legs trembling as he sank down. His mind was a whirlwind, thoughts tumbling over one another like stones in a river. He stared at his grandmother as she returned to her baking, her movements slower now, almost meditative. The dough yielded beneath her hands, a stark contrast to the chaos spinning in his head. How could this be fixed? Oakwood wasn't just a collection of houses and memorials, it was a living, breathing place, proud of its past, yet shackled by it. Could a town so steeped in its ways ever change? The warmth of the house wrapped around him like a blanket, and in that moment, clarity pierced through the storm of his thoughts. This wasn't just about him or that single, suffocating moment with the officers. It was about what Oakwood had become and when it could still be, if people dared to confront the ugliness they'd ignored for too long. Marcus watched his son from across the room, his gaze softening as he took in the furrow of David's brow, the way his jaw tightened with resolve. He could almost hear the gears grinding in David's mind, see the fire kindling behind his eyes. This wasn't just anger, though there was plenty of that, simmering hot and raw. No, this was determination, a spark of something fierce and unyielding. Marcus's chest swelled with a strange mix of pride and fear. David wasn't the kind of kid to shrug this off, to let it fade into the background like a bad dream. He'd seen an injustice, felt its sting, and now he was wrestling with what came next. In that instant, Marcus knew his son wouldn't be a bystander, it'd be a force, a voice demanding better. "We'll figure this out," Marcus murmured, the words slipping out more for himself than anyone else. He crossed the room, resting a hand on David's shoulder. "But for now, let's eat. We'll need our strength." David nodded, a flicker of gratitude warming his chest. The peace of the house, the steady presence of his family, it grounded him, even as the weight of the day lingered like a shadow. This wasn't over. Questions loomed unanswered, and Oakwood itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the truth to break free. As they gathered around the table, the clink of plates and the rustle of napkins filled the silence. But beneath it all, David felt a shift. The town might never be the same, and maybe, just maybe, that was the point. Change didn't come easy, but this could be where it began. The evening settled into an uneasy quiet, the kitchen glowing softly under the hum of a single bulb. Steam curled upward from the bread Evelyn sliced, its golden crust cracking under her knife. David poked at his food, his fork tracing aimless patterns through the mashed potatoes. Every time he blinked, Officer Grant's face flashed behind his eyelid, shows cold, piercing eyes. That voice dripping with disdain. The way the air had thickened with judgment, as though David's very presence was a crime. His stomach churned, not from hunger but from the memory of being watched, measured, and found wanting in his own neighborhood. Evelyn glanced at Marcus, her son-in-law's silence stretching taut across the room. He wasn't one to brood. Marcus was a man of motion, always tackling problems with a steady hand and a clear head. But tonight, his eyes were distant, clouded with a tempest he hadn't yet unleashed. She cleared her throat, a soft sound that sliced through the stillness. "Marcus, you're too quiet tonight," she said, her tone gentle but edged with insistence. "What's going on in that head of yours?" He looked up, meeting her gaze, and for a moment, the storm broke free. "I don't know, Mom," he said, his voice low and gravelly, each word dragged from a place deep within. "I keep replaying it, David, those officers, the way they looked at him like he was a threat. But it's not just that, it's Oakwood. We've been pretending everything's fine for too long, acting like these problems don't exist. It's not just a misunderstanding, it's the whole damn system, the way it's built. And I don't know how to fix it alone." His fingers tightened around his glass, the faint creak of strain audible in the quiet. Evelyn's expression softened, though her eyes gleamed with a fierce understanding. She knew Marcus carried a heavy load as Oakwood's new police chief, a job he'd taken with pride, vowing to protect and serve. But the system he'd inherited was a fractured thing, riddled with cracks no single man could patch. Now it was personal. His son, his bright, curious David, had been caught in its jaws, and the pain of that cut deeper than any professional setback. "You've always said it's more than enforcing laws," she replied, her voice steady. "It's about keeping people safe. You've taught David that. But what's the point if they don't feel safe here, in their own home?" Marcus leaned back, his chair creaking under the shift of his weight. Her words landed like a punch, simple yet piercing. He'd spent years believing his role was about trust, building it, earning it, upholding it. But the way those officers had treated David, his own flesh and blood, shattered that illusion. Justice wasn't just about catching the bad guys. It was about ensuring every soul in Oakwood could walk its streets without fear. Power, when abused, didn't just harm individuals, it eroded the very foundation of a community. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice firming with resolve. "Maybe it's time for something to shift, not just for me, but for the department, for this town. We need to talk, really talk, and I've got to lead that charge." David's head snapped up, his fork clattering softly against his plate. He met his father's eyes, seeing the conflict there, with burden of duty warring with a father's instinct to protect. Marcus wasn't backing down. He wasn't brushing this under the rug. "You're going to talk to them?" David asked, his voice small but threaded with hope. Marcus nodded, a faint, weary smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, son. But it's more than talk. I'm going to make sure this doesn't happen again to you, to anyone. We're doing things differently now." Evelyn leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly on the table. "It won't be easy, Marcus. People don't change fast. It'll take time, more than you might want it to give." "I know," he said, his gaze steady, "but it's got to start somewhere. I've looked the other way too long." No more. The conversation turned practical steps Marcus could take, changes he could push within the department, ways to reach out to a community that had grown wary of the badge he wore. For David, it was a lifeline. His dad wasn't just seeing the problem, was owning it. The road ahead would be rough, paved with resistance and hard truths, but it was a road nonetheless. The days that followed blurred together. David trudged back to school, his backpack slung over one shoulder as his classmates chattered around him, oblivious to the weight he carried. The tension of that day lingered, a dull ache in his chest, but it was buried beneath the rhythm of algebra lessons and cafeteria noise. At home, though, the air buzzed with purpose. Marcus came home late, his uniform rumpled, his face etched with exhaustion. He'd been meeting with officers, some defensive, others quietly ashamed, sitting with community leaders who spoke in hushed, urgent tones about years of mistrust. David didn't grasp all the details, the policies and politics his father wrestled with, but he felt the shift. This wasn't just about rules or badges, it was about people, about a town split by invisible lines drawn long ago. It was about fear and assumptions that had hardened into something toxic, and the slow, painful work of uprooting them. One evening, as the sun dipped below Oakwood's tree-lined horizon, David sat on the porch, the wood cool beneath his palms. He thought of Officer Grant, not just the man, but what he represented, a system that too often turned a blind eye to its own flaws. Justice, he realized, wasn't a gift handed down. It was a fight, a promise that had to be kept. And consequences came not just for the powerless, but for the powerful who forgot their duty. Oakwood might never shed its past entirely, but with his father's resolve and his own quiet determination, maybe it could step toward something better. The crickets sang into the twilight, and for the first time in days, David felt a flicker of hope. In the wake of a troubling incident that had shaken Marcus to his core, he summoned his officers, among them Officer Grant and Officer Bacurdo, a gathering that felt heavier than any routine briefing. The small conference room at the Oakwood Police Department was their meeting ground, its faded walls cluttered with stacks of weathered case files and bulletin boards plastered with flyers so old the edges curled inward. Dust motes danced in the slanting afternoon light, and the air carried the faint mustiness of neglect. Marcus positioned himself at the front, his broad shoulders squared with a resolve that had been dormant for far too long. His dark eyes scanned the room, locking briefly on each face before he spoke. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice steady yet laced with an unmistakable firmness, "we're here to confront something critical, something we can't ignore any longer. We need to talk about how we operate in this town, about racial profiling, about the way we carry ourselves as officers. What happened last week was a disgrace. Plain and simple. The weight of his words settled over the room like a storm cloud. Officer Grant, a weary man with thinning hair and a perpetually tight jaw, shifted in his metal chair, the legs scraping faintly against the linoleum floor. He kept his gaze fixed on a crack in the table, avoiding Marcus's piercing stare as if it might burn through him. Guilt gnawed at him not because he fully grasped the depth of his actions, but because he sensed the tide turning against the way things had always been done. Officer Baker, younger and less hardened, sat with his elbows on the table, his brow creased in deep thought. His fingers tapped absently against the armrest, betraying a flicker of unease. He'd joined the force with ideals of justice, but now those ideals clashed with the reality Marcus laid bare. Neither man had anticipated this reckoning. To them, they'd simply been following protocol, doing their jobs, but Marcus wasn't here for excuses. His mind was consumed by a singular mission, ensuring no one else endured what his son, David, had faced. "I've known you both for years," Marcus continued, his tone softening just enough to reveal the man beneath the chief's badge. "I've seen the good in your dedication, your grit. But being good officers isn't enough if we let flaws fester. We've been given a duty to protect this community, to serve every single person in Oakwood. How can we do that if we're blind to who they are? How can we uphold justice if we're chaining people to assumptions before they even open their mouths?" His voice trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from the raw emotion fueling his words. The room fell into a heavy silence, the kind that presses against your chest and forces introspection. No one dared interrupt, not Grant, not Baker, not the handful of other officers scattered around the table. It was a conversation long overdue, a jagged crack in the foundation of their work that Marcus was determined to mend. In the days that followed, an undercurrent of change rippled through Oakwood. The police station hummed with a quieter energy, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what came next. At home, David felt it most acutely. His father wasn't the man he'd been a week. There was a spark in Marcus's eyes, a fierce determination that seemed to light up the dim corners of their modest living room. Once a figure of steady routine, Marcus now spent late nights hunched over policy drafts, his pen scratching furiously against paper as he mapped out reforms. He attended community forums, his deep voice cutting through the murmurs of skeptical residents, and returned home with stacks of notes and a weary but unbroken spirit. For David, it was both inspiring and unsettling. He admired his father's fire, yet a quiet doubt lingered in his chest. Cooled Oakwood really shed the weight of its past. He'd grown up here, walked its cracked sidewalks his whole life, and the sit-along glances, the unspoken judgments, felt as permanent as the oak trees lining Main Street. David tried to push forward, to let normalcy anchor him. School dragged on with its familiar rhythm algebra equations and locker room chatter, but even there, the ripples of his father's actions reached him. His friends, a tight-knit group of teenagers who'd known him since grade school, began whispering about the incident. One afternoon, as David trudged home under a graying sky, he caught snippets of their conversation trailing behind him. "Did you hear about David's dad?" one of them muttered, his voice hushed as if the wind might carry it too far. "They're saying he's shaking things up at the station, something about treating people fair, you know?" The other nodded, kicking a pebble down the street. "Yeah, people are talking about it everywhere." David's stomach twisted. He didn't turn around, didn't let them see the flush creeping up his neck. They meant well, but they didn't get it, not really. To them, it was gossip, a fleeting headline. To David, it was the memory of an officer's cold stare, the sting of being made to feel like an outsider in his own neighborhood. That night, Marcus came home exhausted, his uniform rumpled from a day of relentless meetings. He found David at the kitchen table, textbooks splayed out but untouched. Instead, the boy was scribbling in a worn notebook, his pencil moving with a quiet intensity. Marcus eased into a chair beside him, the wood creaking under his weight. "What's that, Tim?" he asked gently, peering over David's shoulder. The nickname short for Timothy. A family jest softened the moment. David hesitated, his fingers tightening around the pencil, then slid the notebook toward his father. It was a list, messy but deliberate. Ideas for Oakwood, neighborhood meetings, a mentorship program, ways to bridge the gap between the police And the people, just some thoughts. David mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. Things I could do to help Mabe, not just with the police, but how people treat each other. Marcus's chest swelled with a pride so fierce it nearly overwhelmed him. He traced a finger along the jagged handwriting, reading each suggestion with care. David had always been thoughtful, a kid who noticed the world's quiet injustices long before he had the words to name them. Now, at 16, he was stepping into something bigger, his mind stretching toward a vision of Oakwood that Marcus himself had only begun to imagine. "This is incredible, Tim," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so damn proud of you. But listing change like this, it's a slow burn. It takes time, patience. You're on the right path, though." David's lips curved into a tentative smile, a flicker of hope igniting in his hazel eyes. "Maybe we could start small," he ventured. "Like a block party. Get everyone together, neighbors, cops, everyone, just to talk, to see each other differently." Marcus leaned back, considering it. The idea was simple, almost naive in its optimism. But that's what made it powerful. A block party could be a spark, a chance to stitch together the frayed threads of a divided town. "You know what?" he said, standing with a newfound energy. "Let's run it by your grandma. See if we can pull it off." Over the next few days, father and son threw themselves into the plan. They knocked on doors, bartered with local shop owners for food and supplies, and even convinced a reluctant Officer Baker to spread the word among the force. It wasn't easy. Oakwood's scars ran deep, and trust was a fragile thing, but it was a beginning. The night before the event, David sat alone in his room, the glow of a desk lamp casting shadows across his notebook. Pages spilled over with dreams and doubts, a chaotic tangle of ink that mirrored his restless mind. Downstairs, Marcus's voice rumbled softly, hashing out details with David's grandmother, a woman whose sharp wit and warm heart had steadied their family through countless storms. David traced a finger over his latest entry, "What if they don't come?" and let the question hang there, unanswered. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a fragile thread of possibility weaving through his fear. When the day arrived, Oakwood buzzed with a nervous energy. The block party unfolded under a sky streaked with pink and gold, folding tables groaning under trays of barbecue and homemade pies. Neighbors milled about, their laughter mingling with the hum of a borrowed speaker playing old soul tunes. Officer Baker lingered near the edge, his uniform swapped for a plain t-shirt, chatting awkwardly with a group of kids. Grant was there too, quieter than usual, his eyes darting as if he half expected judgment to descend. Marcus moved through the crowd, shaking hands and listening to stories of frustration and faint hope. David watched it all, his heart pounding with a mix of pride and uncertainty. It wasn't a cure, not yet, but it was a messy, imperfect step towards something better. In that moment, Marcus and David glimpsed a truth that lingered beyond the day's warmth. Justice wasn't just about punishment or power. It was about accountability, about facing the consequences of wielding authority without care. For Marcus, it meant dismantling the systems he'd once upheld. For David, it meant daring to believe in a town that could heal. And for Oakwood, it meant the slow, painful work of seeing each other anew. David woke that morning with a heart full of restless anticipation, a feeling that had been building inside him for days, swelling with every passing hour of the last week. He'd spent countless moments lost in thought, picturing what might unfold, dreaming of the possibilities that now hovered just within reach. As he lay in bed, staring at the familiar cracks in the ceiling of his Oakwood home, he could almost feel the town holding its breath alongside him, teetering on the edge of something monumental. The air itself seemed charged, buzzing with an electric tension that whispered of change, whether for better or worse. He couldn't yet say. With a deep breath, he pushed himself up and headed downstairs, his footsteps light but purposeful, drawn by the comforting aroma of sizzling bacon and scrambled eggs wafting through the house. In the kitchen, his father, Marcus, stood over the stove, a spatula in hand and a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The tension that had weighed on him like a dark cloud in the days prior seemed to have lifted, if only slightly. His broad shoulders, usually hunched with the burden of responsibility, were relaxed today, and his eyes deep brown and weathered by years of hard choice shelled a spark of something David hadn't seen in ages. Hope. It was subtle, flickering like a candle in a drafty room, but it was there, and it warmed David's chest to see it. Marcus didn't say much at first, just flipped a golden pancake with a practiced flick of his wrist. But when he finally spoke, his voice carried a lightness that felt almost foreign. "Hey, Tim," he said, using the nickname he'd given David years ago, a playful jab at his son's tendency to overthink. "You ready for today?" David slid into a chair at the table, his hands fidgeting nervously against the worn wood. "I think so," he replied, his voice betraying the storm of emotions swirling inside him. I hope people show up. I hope they're willing to hear us out." His words hung in the air, fragile and uncertain, mirroring the doubts that gnawed at him. What if no one came? What if they came but didn't care? Marcus set the pancake down on a plate with a soft clatter and eased into the seat, across from his son, sliding the food toward him. His gaze was steady, reassuring. "You've done your part, David," he said, his tone firm yet gentle. "You've started the conversation. That's what counts. The rest is just about showing up. That's all any of us can do." There was a quiet strength in those words, a lifeline tossed to David in the midst of his spiraling thoughts. He managed a small smile, the knot in his stomach loosening just enough to let him breathe. His dad always knew what to say, how to make the impossible feel possible, even when the world seemed stacked against them. As they ate, the neighborhood outside their modest home began to stir, like a sleepy giant rousing from a long slumber. Through the kitchen window, David watched as people trickled onto the street, their movements purposeful yet tinged with a cautious energy. Booths sprang up along the block, their wooden frames draped with colorful banners fluttering in the morning breeze. Tables were hauled into place, laden with trays of food and stacks of flyers, while neighbors exchanged quick greetings over the hum of activity. The air carried the mingled scents of grilled meat and freshly baked bread, a promise of community that felt both comforting and fragile. This wasn't just another Saturday gathering in Oakwood. This was something bigger, something daring. For years, the town had been trapped in a cycle of mistrust and unspoken grievances, a place where power had to often been wielded like a club rather than a shield. Today was about breaking that cycle, about daring to imagine a future where justice wasn't just a word, but a lived reality. And yet, beneath the excitement, there was an undercurrent of unease. Change, as everyone in Oakwood knew, was a jagged path, littered with resistance and hard-earned lessons. When breakfast was done, David and Marcus stepped outside into the vibrant chaos of the street. The scene was alive with motion. Children darted between legs, their laughter piercing the air, while adults clustered in small groups, their voices a low murmur of curiosity and skepticism. David hesitated on the porch, his sneakers scuffing against the weathered wood as he took it all in. He felt small, out of place amidst the bustle, still wrestling with the fear that his efforts might amount to nothing. But Marcus was already in his element, striding forward with the quiet confidence of a man who'd seen worse days and lived to tell the tale. He clapped a hand on a neighbor's shoulder, exchanged a warm handshake with another, his deep voice cutting through the noise as he checked on the details where the table sat. Was the sound system working? David watched him for a moment, then plunged into the crowd himself, letting the tide of people carry him along. His grandmother, a weary woman with a sharp tongue and a heart as big as the town itself, had outdone herself as always. She stood near a long table piled high with platters of fried chicken, cornbread, and her famous peach cobbler, barking orders at anyone who dared linger too long without helping. "Don't just stand there gawking. Child, grab a plate or get moving," she snapped at a teenage boy, who scurried off with a sheepish grin. David's friends had claimed a corner near the music table, where a portable speaker blared a mix of old-school soul and modern beats. They waved him over, their faces bright with the kind of easy camaraderie that only youth could muster. But David's attention snagged on something else, the sight of police officers, mingling with the crowd. There was Officer Grant, a burly man with a graying beard. His usual stern demeanor softened as he nodded awkwardly at a group of women chatting nearby. Officer Baker, younger and wearier, hovered near the edge of the gathering, her hands stuffed in her pockets as if unsure where they belonged, without a badge to back them up. Several other members of the force were scattered throughout, their civilian clothes doing little to mask the authority they carried like a second skin. David studied them, noting the stiffness in their postures, the fleeting glances they exchanged as they tried to blend in. This wasn't easy for them. Could see it in the way Grant's shoulders tensed when someone approached, or how Baker's eyes darted to the side before she forced a smile. They were used to being the enforcers, the ones who stood apart, not the ones who joined the circle. But that was the whole point of this day, to strip away the walls that power had built, to prove that people were more than their roles, more than the assumptions that had kept Oakwood divided for so long. Justice, David realized, wasn't just about punishment, it was about accountability, about facing the consequences of wielding power without care. A few hours later, the sun hung high in the sky, casting long shadows across the street as Marcus climbed onto the rickety stage they'd rigged up at the block's end. He wasn't a born orator. His words often came out rough around the edges, shaped more by action than eloquence, but today, something was different. He stood there, broad and unyielding, not just as Oakwood's police chief, but as a father, a neighbor, a man who'd poured his soul into this place and seen it bleed in return. "Thank you all for coming out today," he began, his voice booming through the borrowed microphone, reaching every corner of the crowd. "It means everything to me, to David, to everyone here who wants this town to be a place where people feel safe, respected, and heard." A ripple of agreement moved through the listeners' nods, a smattering of applause, but there was skepticism too, a wariness etched into furrowed brows and crossed arms. These were people who'd been promised change before, who'd watched hope flicker and die under the weight of broken trust. Marcus pressed on, undeterred. "This isn't about dwelling on what's gone wrong, it's about looking ahead, moving forward together. There's been pain here, too much hurt, too many assumptions. But today, we're changing that. We're listening, we're talking, we're seeing each other as people, not just labels." His words settled over the crowd like a heavy blanket, warm but challenging. David, standing near the edge of the stage, felt their weight sink into his bones. This wasn't a block party anymore, it was a reckoning. Marcus paused, then straightened, his jaw set. "As your chief, I've failed in some ways. I own that. But that stops now. I'm here to make things right, and I'm asking y'all of you to help me do it. It's going to take every one of us." Pride swelled in David's chest, sharp and bright, as he watched his father lay himself bare before the town. Admitting fault wasn't easy for a man like Marcus, whose life had been defined by duty and grit. But it was real. It was the kind of raw honesty that could ignite something lasting, a flame to guide Oakwood out of its shadows. David wasn't just a spectator in that momente, was part of it, tethered to a movement that felt bigger than himself. As the afternoon stretched on, the air softened, the initial awkwardness giving way to tentative connections. Strangers who'd lived streets apart for years struck up conversations, their voices rising and falling over shared stories and cautious laughter. The officers shed some of their guardedness. Grant lingered with a group of elders, his head bowed as he listened to tales of Oakwood's past, while Baker, less hesitant now, swapped jokes with David's classmates near the music table. It wasn't flawless, but it was a beginning, a crack in the armor of mistrust that had long defined the town. As dusk crept in, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, the streetlights buzzed to life, casting a gentle glow over the waning crowd. David stood amidst the fading bustle, a quiet hope blooming inside him. Oakwood's troubles wouldn't vanish overnight. There was no quick fix for decades of wounds. But today had been a reminder of what was possible. Progress could start small, with a handshake, a shared meal, a willingness to listen. The block party wound down, tables folded and goodbyes exchanged, but its echo lingered in the air, a promise of something just beginning. Neighbors who'd once passed each other with averted eyes now paused to nod, to speak, to see each other anew. It was messy, imperfect, and fraught with challenges, but Marcus and David had cracked open a door that had been bolted shut for too long. The lesson was clear: power unchecked bred division, but power tempered by humility could heal. The next day, Oakwood felt subtly altered, as if the earth itself had shifted beneath its streets. The change was faint, a softer cadence to the morning chatter, A flicker of acknowledgement in strangers' glance, but it was there. People moved with a touch more care, their smiles less guarded, their steps less hurried. For Marcus, though, the work was only starting. That Monday, he sat in his cramped office at the precinct, the desk buried under stacks of case files and scribbled notes from the event. His mind replayed the weekend in vivid fragments the way Mrs. Carter's voice had trembled as she spoke of her son's arrest years ago. The way young Tommy from down the block had asked if the police would ever stop eyeing him like a suspect. It had been humbling, even overwhelming, to hear the town's pain laid bare. But it was the listening thrill, unguarded listening, that had struck him deepest. Change wasn't a speech or a single day, it was a commitment. A daily grind of accountability he'd have to enforce, starting with himself. David, too, was still untangling his thoughts as he walked to the park to meet his friends that afternoon. The memory of his father's speech lingered, mingling with the faces in the crowd, some hopeful, some doubtful, all searching for proof that this time would be different. He'd felt a surge of pride watching Marcus step up, but he knew words alone wouldn't erase the years of profiling he'd endured. The sideways glances that followed him because of his skin. Real justice demanded more than talk. It lived in the quiet choices, the small acts of courage that piled up over time. At the park, his friends lounged on the swings, their laughter cutting through the crisp air. "Hey, Tim," one called as he neared, his voice tinged with awe. "That was wild, huh? The cops actually saying sorry, didn't see that coming." David settled onto a swing, the chains creaking under his weight. "Yeah, it was weird. Good. Though, I don't know if it'll last, but at least people are talking now." His friend kicked at the dirt, his expression skeptical. "You think they'll really change, though?" "The cops?" David stared out at the horizon, the question settling heavy in his gut. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice steady despite the uncertainty. "But if they don't, we'll keep pushing. We've got to." The words felt like a vow, a quiet resolve born from the day Oakwood had dared to look itself in the mirror. Power had consequences, and justice wasn't just a gift, it was a fight worth waging, one step at a time. The air in Oakwood carried a faint hum of possibility, a subtle shift that lingered even as the everyday grind of life resumed its rhythm. David stood on the cracked sidewalk outside his grandmother's house, hands stuffed deep in his pockets, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the street. "I don't know," he admitted to his friend Jamal, his voice raw with a sincerity that surprised even himself. "But I think it has to matter. If we want things to get better, really better, we can't just leave it up to chance. It's not enough to hope the police will figure it out on their own. It's got to be all of us, the whole neighborhood, every single person pulling together." His words hung there, heavy with a quiet urgency, as if he were trying to convince himself as much as Jamal. Jamal leaned against the rusted chain-link fence, his brow furrowed, his usual easy grin replaced by a thoughtful frown. He kicked at a pebble with the toe of his sneaker, sending it skittering across the pavement. "Yeah, I hear you," he said after a long pause, his tone slow and deliberate, like he was piecing together a puzzle in his mind. "But where do we even begin? It's not like we can snap our fingers and fix everything." David's face lit up with a small, determined smile, the kind that hinted at a fire burning beneath his uncertainty. "We start small. Man, we do what we did yesterday, taking, listening, asking the hard questions. We don't let people just shrug it off and forget. We keep reminding everyone we're in this together, whether they like it or not." Meanwhile, across town, Marcus sat at his worn oak kitchen table, the faint hum of the refrigerator filling the silence between his words. The late afternoon light filtered through the blinds, casting slanted golden lines across the room. He faced Officers Grant and Baker, two men whose uniforms once symbolized authority, but now felt like fragile shields against the weight of the conversation. This wasn't about the block party anymore. That fleeting burst of unity had been a spark, but now they were chasing the flame. Marcus's voice carried a steely resolve, deeper and more unwavering than it had been in weeks. "Gentlemen," he began, leaning forward, his hands clasped tightly on the table. "We've seen what happens when we stop and listen, really listen to the people out there. We've felt their frustrations, their fears, their hopes. But one good day doesn't erase years of mistrust. It's not enough to show up once and call it done. We've got to earn their trust every single day, not just as badges, but as human beings who live here too. Officer Grant, a stocky man with graying temples and a perpetual squint, had been silent for most of the meeting, his fingers nervously tracing the rim of his coffee mug. Now, he shifted in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight, and spoke up. His voice rough but earnest. "You're right, Chief. I've been chewing on this for days, and it's eating at me. I always thought I was doing my job, clocking, follow orders, keep the peace. But that's not enough anymore, is it? It's not just about the rules. It's about how we make people feel, whether they see us as protectors or threats." His admission hung in the air, raw and unguarded, a crack in the armor of a man who'd spent decades hiding behind protocol. Marcus felt a surge of relief wash over him, a quiet gratitude that Grant had the guts to say it out loud. In a job where pride often choked out vulnerability, that kind of honesty was the first step toward something real. He turned his gaze to Officer Baker, a younger man with sharp features and a habit of fidgeting when the spotlight landed on him. Baker shifted uncomfortably, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor, his eyes darting to the window as if searching for an escape. "What about you, Baker?" Marcus pressed, his tone firm but not unkind. Baker swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as he forced the words out. I think I've been scared to rock the boat. I've just done what I was told, followed the playbook, kept my head down. But that's not cutting it anymore. I've got to start asking why we do things this way. Why it's always been like this. I don't want to just follow orders blind anymore." His confession was halting, almost painful, but there was a spark of defiance in it, a flicker of awakening that Marcus latched onto. Marcus studied them both, these men who'd spent years upholding a system that was starting to show its cracks. They weren't perfect, none of them were, but they were beginning to see it. This wasn't just about patching up mistakes. It was about tearing down the walls of complacency, questioning the very foundation they'd stood on, and rebuilding something better from the rubble. Justice, Marcus realized, wasn't a gift you handed out, it was a garden you cultivated, day by painstaking day. "We're going to move forward, step by step," he said, rising to his feet, his shadow stretching across the table. "But there's no going back now. We've got to keep pushing, no matter how hard it gets." As the days rolled into weeks, Oakwood buzzed with a quiet, stubborn energy. The streets still thrummed with the chaos of daily life, kids shouting as they raced bikes down the block, cars rumbling past with bass-heavy music spilling from open window spit beneath it all. Something was shifting. People lingered a little longer on their porches, exchanging nods or quick hellos instead of hurrying past with their heads down. David felt it every time he stepped outside, a fragile thread of connection weaving its way through the neighborhood. It wasn't loud or obvious, no grand speeches or banners flying overhead, but it was there, in the way Mrs. Carter waved from her garden, or how Mr. Lopez stopped to ask about his dad's latest meeting. Change was slow, a whisper rather than a shout, but David clung to it like a lifeline. Back home, Marcus threw himself into the work with a fervor that bordered on obsession. His days blurred into a marathon of meetings shuttled with community leaders in cramped living rooms, poring over policy drafts late into the night, shaking hands with residents who'd once eyed him with suspicion. For Marcus, this wasn't just a job anymore, it was a reckoning. He'd seen the damage wrought by unchecked power, how a single careless moment could fracture trust for years, and he'd be damned if he let it happen again. Every decision he made now carried the weight of his son's future, of Oakwood's future, of a promise he'd silently made to himself to leave this place better than he'd found it. One humid afternoon, David sprawled across the sagging wicker chair on his grandmother Evelyn's porch, the faint creak of the boards beneath him blending with the distant hum of a lawnmower. His dad's patrol car rolled by, Marcus's silhouette rigid behind the wheel. Off to yet another meeting, David watched him go, a mix of pride and exhaustion swirling in his chest. Marcus didn't seem to notice the way his tireless effort rippled outward, shaping his son's belief in what was possible. Every late-night conversation, every admission of fault, every stubborn push forward, it all sank into David, rooting itself deep, whispering that change wasn't a fairy tale but a fight worth waging. Evelyn emerged from the house, her steps slow but steady, a glass of iced tea sweating in her hand. She settled beside him, her floral dress brushing the armrest, her presence a quiet anchor in the storm of his thoughts. "You're awfully quiet today, Tim," she said, her voice warm and teasing as she handed him the drink. David's fingers curled around the cold glass, the chill grounding him as he took a slow sip. "Just thinking, Grandma," he murmured, his gaze drifting to the street. "Everything's changing, but sometimes it feels like it's not enough, like we're stuck spinning our wheels." Evelyn's lips curved into a soft smile, her eyes crinkling with a wisdom earned through decades of watching the world shift and stumble. "Change isn't always a fireworks show, you know. It's the little things, the conversations, the moments someone decides to listen instead of turn away. It builds up, slow and steady." David nodded, the tea bitter on his tongue. "But what if it doesn't last? What if people just give up and everything slides back to how it was?" His voice cracked, betraying the fear he'd been carrying since the night those officers trailed him home, their headlights burning into his back. Evelyn let the question settle, her silence thoughtful rather than dismissive. "Change is a stubborn thing," she said at last, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "It digs in deep, even when you can't see it. Look at how much you've grown, how much you've pushed. Look at your dad, breaking his back to make things right. It's not loud, but it's real. The trick is sticking with it, even when it feels like you're shouting into the wind." Her words sank into him, easing the knot in his chest. He glanced out at the neighborhood kids laughing, a dog barking in the distance, and felt a flicker of hope reignite. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was enough to keep going, one small step at a time. The following week, Marcus called a town hall meeting, a bold move that had David's stomach twisting with equal parts pride and dread. The night arrived under a heavy sky, the air thick with humidity as people trickled into the squat brick building on Elm Street. The room was a patchwork of fast-eyed mothers clutching toddlers, gray-haired men with skeptical frowns, teenagers slouched in folding chairs, whispering among themselves. Officers Grant and Baker stood near the back, their uniforms crisp but their expressions uneasy, like they were still finding their footing in this new world. Even a few outsiders from neighboring towns had shown up, drawn by rumors of Oakwood's quiet revolution. Marcus stepped to the front, his broad shoulders squared, his face etched with a somber determination that silenced the restless hum of the crowd. "Thank you for being here," he began, his voice steady but laced with a gravity that pulled everyone in. "I know things haven't been easy. I know there's doubt, questions, maybe even anger. But tonight, we've got a choice set to keep sitting in the mess or to start building something better. Not just for us, but for our kids, and their kids after them." The room stirred, a ripple of nods and murmurs spreading like a current. David, perched near the door, felt his heart thud against his ribs. This was the moment Oakwood could rise or falter. And as Marcus spoke, laying bare the failures of power unchecked and the promise of justice reclaimed, David knew they were all in it together, for better or worse. On that crisp evening in Oakwood, the air buzzed with a restless energy as Marcus stood before the gathered crowd, his voice steady yet brimming with an undercurrent of urgency. "We might not transform everything overnight," he began, his eyes sweeping across the sea of faces, some skeptical, others hopeful, "but we can plant the seeds of change right here, right now. It starts with opening our ears to one another, truly grasping where each of us is coming from, and owning up to our responsibilities. Every single one of us, police officers, neighbors, parents, even the kids, has a part to play in this." His words hung in the air, heavy with promise and expectation. As the townsfolk shifted in their seats, absorbing the weight of what he'd said, a thick silence settled over the room, the kind that presses against your chest, until a voice attentive but clear pierced through from the back. "And what if it all falls apart? What if we slide right back into the mess we've always known?" The question lingered like smoke, curling around the edges of everyone's thoughts. Marcus turned toward the sound, his brow furrowing slightly as he nodded, not dismissing the fear but meeting it head on. "If it doesn't stick, we don't throw up our hands and walk away. We dust ourselves off, we try again, and we keep pushing forward. But here's the key: we never stop calling each other out when we stray. We've already lit the spark, and I've got faith in this town. I've got faith in every one of you." His gaze softened, a flicker of resolve shining through, as if he could will that belief into their hearts. What followed wasn't a polite exchange of pleasantries, it was raw, electric. A collision of voices spilling over with pent-up frustration, guarded hope, and everything in between. People leaned forward, their words tumbling out like stones loosened from a crumbling wall. An older woman with tired eyes spoke of the sting of being dismissed by officers years ago, her voice trembling with the ache of memory. A young father, arms crossed tightly, admitted he'd taught his kids to steer clear of anyone in a uniformist distrust rooted deep, like a tree weathered by storms. Then came the officers themselves, their tones a mix of defensiveness and sincerity. One, a broad-shouldered man named Officer Grant, rubbed the back of his neck as he confessed the exhaustion of walking a beat, where every glance felt like a judgment. Another, Officer Baker, quieter and more reserved, shared how he'd started rethinking the way he approached his patrols, determined to earn back a trust he hadn't realized was so fragile. There were no tidy solutions, no grand promises carved in stone, but as the voices wove together, a fragile thread of unity began to form a shared longing to mend what had been broken. When the meeting finally dissolved into murmurs and the scrape of chairs, David stepped out of the town hall beside his father, Marcus. The night air brushed cool against his skin, a stark contrast to the heat of the room they'd left behind. The streets stretched out before them, hushed and still, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. For once, that quiet didn't feel like an absence, like something vital had been stripped away. David's chest swelled with a cautious optimism as he glanced up at his dad. "I think they really heard each other tonight," he said, his voice steady, carrying a conviction he hadn't known he possessed. Marcus looked down at him, the hard lines of his face softening into something tender, almost proud. "They did, son, and that's where it all begins." Weeks trickled by, and Oakwood didn't erupt into some dramatic overhaul. No banners unfurled, no headlines blared. Instead, the change crept in like dawn breaking over the horizon, subtle but undeniable. People didn't just talk about bridging the divides. That had festered for years. They rolled up their sleeves and got to work. The police department rolled out new efforts, small but deliberate. Officers traded stiff, formal patrols for casual meetups, coffee in hand. Badges less imposing, mingling with residents in parks and on porches. It wasn't about rewriting rule books or issuing decrees. It was about faces becoming familiar, about voices carrying warmth instead of suspicion. David, now more woven into the fabric of this shift than he'd ever imagined, felt the difference in his bones. Walking down Maple Street, he caught sight of Officer Grant tossing a football with a couple of kids, their laughter cutting through the afternoon air. Mrs. Carter, who'd always eyed uniforms warily from her stoop, now waved at Officer Baker as he passed, her smile hesitant but real. It wasn't perfect, old wounds didn't vanish overnight, but the tide was turning, slow and steady. One lazy afternoon, David perched on a weathered bench in the park, his favorite spot where the oak trees cast long, dappled shadows. Just yards away, a makeshift booth stood near the community center, manned by Officers Grant and Baker. They weren't barking orders or scanning the crowd with steely gazes. Instead, they leaned in, chatting with a cluster of teenagers from Oakwood High. The kids, usually quick to scatter at the sight of a badge, lingered now, their postures relaxed, their voices rising and falling with easy banter. David watched, a slow grin tugging at his lips. A few weeks ago, this scene would have been a pipe dream, officers and teens trading stories, laughing over some shared joke. Now, it unfolded before him, natural as breathing. Pride bloomed in his chest, warm and unfamiliar, as he realized these weren't just fleeting moments. They were roots taking hold, connections forged not on fear or prejudice, but on something truer: listening, seeing each other as people. Emboldened, David pushed off the bench, his sneakers crunching against the gravel path as he approached the booth. His pulse quickened, a nervous hum beneath his ribs. He hadn't spoken to Grant or Baker since the block party months back, when tension still hung thick between the lines. But today, the air felt lighter, charged with possibility. "Hey, Officer Grant," he called, lifting a hand in a small wave. Grant turned, his weathered face breaking into a grin as recognition sparked in his eyes. "Hey, David, how's it going, kid?" There was no edge to his tone, No guarded distance, just a man glad to see a familiar face. David exhaled, tension melting from his shoulders. It's going good. I've been noticing you guys around a lot more lately, not just driving by, but actually talking to people. Grant chuckled, resting a hand on the booth's edge. Yeah, we're trying something new. Turns out you learn a hell of a lot more about folks when you stop and shoot the breeze, instead of rolling through like you're on a mission. And you know what? It's working. People are starting to look at us like we're part of this place, not just enforcers passing through. Trust's a hard thing to build, but we're damn determined to earn it. David nodded, chewing on that for a moment. I've seen it too. People are chatting more not just with you, but with each other. It's like they're waking up, starting to give a damn again. Officer Baker, who'd been listening with a quiet intensity, chimed in, his voice low but earnest. Rebuilding trust isn't a straight line, David. Some days it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But every conversation chips away at the wall, one at a time. David's smile widened, a flicker of relief washing over him. I think it's working. People are starting to see we're all just people. Not cops, not troublemakers, just us. Grant's expression shifted, growing solemn as he locked eyes with David. You know, I owe you an apology, kid. Back when this all kicked off, I didn't see Yunit really. I saw a teenager on the street and jumped to conclusions, assumed the worst. But I've learned something since then. It's easy to slap a label on someone and call it a day. It's a lot tougher to shut up, listen, and actually see who's standing in front of you. The words hit David like a quiet thunderclap, lodging a lump in his throat. He blinked, caught off guard by the raw honesty from a man he'd once viewed as unyielding stone. It's okay, he managed, his voice softer than he intended. I get it, changing's not easy. I'm just glad you're trying. Baker stepped closer, his tone gentle but firm. We're all trying. David, it's not just you or your dad carrying this, it's us too. We're in it together. As they talked, something shifted inside David, a quiet awakening. He wasn't just a bystander anymore, watching his dad or the officers shoulder the load. He was part of every word he spoke, every hand he extended, nudging Oakwood toward something better. The past didn't vanish, but it didn't define them either. What mattered was this here and now, the steps they took together. That night, David sprawled at his desk, notebook splayed open, his pen flying across the page as thoughts poured out unchecked. His mind churned with what he'd seen, what he'd felt, officers' sincerity, the teenagers' laughter, the slow thaw of a town once frozen in distrust. What could they do next? How could Oakwood keep growing, becoming a place where safety wasn't a privilege, where respect wasn't a rarity? His thoughts drifted to his dad, Marcus, the man who'd lit this fire. David had witnessed the late nights. Marcus hunched over the kitchen table, phone pressed to his ear, voice frayed with exhaustion. He'd seen the furrowed brow, the moments of doubt swallowed by a steely resolve to keep going. Marcus wasn't just the police chief barking orders from a podium. He was a father, a neighbor, a man who carried the weight of his badge not as a crown, but as a call to serve. Justice, David realized, wasn't just about punishment, it was about accountability, about owning your mistakes and building something stronger from the wreckage. Power, when twisted, could fracture a town. Wielded with care, it could heal it. As Marcus sank into a chair at the kitchen table that evening, his eyes found David scribbling furiously. It had become their ritual, David dreaming on paper, Marcus sifting through the day's battles and victories. The room hummed with a quiet intimacy, the kind that didn't need words to fill it. You were right, son, Marcus said, his voice rough but warm. It's working. We've come a long way, but the real grind starts keeping the momentum, keeping people talking, keeping them listening. David's pen paused, his gaze lifting to meet his dad's. Yeah, Dad. But we'll get there together, in that shared silence, surrounded by the soft glow of the lamp and the distant chirp of crickets. Marcus felt a swell of certainty. Oakwood wasn't just a precinct or a collection of streets anymore. It was a community, flawed, stubborn, but fighting to rise, and for the first time in years, he knew he was exactly where he belonged. The twilight air hung soft and still over Oakwood as David sat perched on the edge of his bed, gazing out through the smudged glass of his bedroom window. The streets below glowed faintly under the amber hum of streetlights, alive with the distant echoes of life, children shrieking with delight as they darted through overgrown yards, neighbors exchanging warm words over picket fences, the low murmur of conversations drifting like a melody on the breeze. It was a scene that wrapped around him like a worn quilt, familiar yet transformed, carrying a quiet peace that hadn't existed in the Oakwood of just a few months prior. His chest swelled with a strange mix of pride and wonder as he traced the outlines of this shifting world, a world he was beginning to understand in ways he never had before. David's thoughts wandered to his father, Marcus, the man who had always been a towering figure in his life, broad-shouldered, resolute, the police chief who carried the weight of the town on his back. But lately, Marcus had revealed a different side, one softened by vulnerability and hardened by resolve. David replayed the late-night talks they'd shared at the kitchen table, the way Marcus's voice had trembled when he admitted the flaws, woven into the fabric of their community, flaws he'd once ignored, flaws that had festered beneath the surface of Oakwood's idyllic veneer. It hadn't been easy for Marcus to face those truths, to peel back the layers of denial and confront the mistrust that had simmered between the police and the people they swore to protect. Yet he'd done it, not with grand gestures, but with a quiet, steady determination that David couldn't help but admire. Those conversations had been raw, heavy with the weight of accountability, but they'd planted a seed, hope that change wasn't just a fleeting dream, but a tangible possibility. Outside, the world wasn't perfect. David knew that better than anyone. Oakwood bore its scars, cracked sidewalks, whispered rumors, the lingering echoes of arguments that had once divided neighbors. No community ever stood flawless, gleaming like some untouchable ideal. But perfection wasn't the point, he realized. It was about the slow, messy climb toward something better, about people daring to grow, to stumble, to learn from the wreckage of their missteps. And they were trying. God, were they trying? David could see it in the way voices no longer sharpened with suspicion, in the way hands reached out instead of pulling back. It wasn't a quick fix, not a bandage slapped over a gaping wound, but a fragile, living thing, a connection blossoming where mistrust had once taken root. The next morning dawned crisp and bright, the kind of day that made the air feel sharp against your skin. David slung his backpack over his shoulder and started his usual trek to school, his sneakers scuffing against the uneven pavement. His mind was still tangled in the thoughts of the night before when something caught his eye, a sight so unexpected it made him pause mid-step. There, outside the school gates, stood Officer Grant and Officer Baker, their navy uniforms stark against the blur of students milling around them. Normally, David would have kept walking, head down, hands shoved deep in his pockets. Cops were just part of the scenery, distant figures who rolled through the streets in their patrol cars, their presence more a formality than a comfort. But today was different. He lingered, curiosity tugging at him like an itch he couldn't ignore. Officer Grant was laughing, a deep, rolling sound that carried over the chatter of the kids. His face, usually set in stern lines, softened as he leaned down to hear a weary boy with a mop of curls ramble about something, his hands waving wildly. There was a warmth there, a flicker of genuine care that David hadn't noticed before. Beside him, Officer Baker stood with his arms crossed, but his posture was relaxed, his dark eyes attentive as he nodded at a girl who spoke in quick, eager bursts. She clutched a notebook to her chest, her words spilling out like she'd been waiting for someone to listen. David edged closer, his breath catching as he watched the scene unfold. These weren't the officers he'd grown up wary of, the ones who barked orders or loomed silently at the edges of town events. They were people, flesh and blood, woven into the moment with a sincerity that struck him hard. "Hey, Tim," Officer Grant's voice broke through David's reverie, warm and familiar, pulling him out of the shadows where he'd been hovering. David's heart gave a quick thud, a flicker of nerves sparking through him. He wasn't used to this, being seen, being called over like he belonged in the conversation. But he stepped forward anyway, forcing a smile as he closed the distance. "Hi, Officer Grant," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Looks like you're making the rounds today." Grant chuckled, his broad shoulders shaking as he glanced at the cluster of kids still buzzing around them. "Just letting folks know we're here to help," he said, his tone easy but deliberate. It's important they see us as part of this place, not just the guys who show up when everything's gone sideways." David nodded, the words sinking in. He could feel a shift in the air. The way people weren't shrinking back from the uniforms anymore. "I think it's working," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "People are talking to you guys more. It feels different." Officer Baker, who'd been silent until now, unfolded his arms and leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful. "It's all about trust, Tim," he said, his voice low and measured, carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too much yet still believed in something better. "We've got to show up, listen, prove we're not just here to lay down the law. We're here when they need us, really here." David's lips curved into a small smile, a spark of hope igniting in his chest. "I think you're doing it," he said. "I've seen it, people looking at you differently, like we're all on the same side now." Grant's gaze settled on David, serious but kind, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "You're right, Tim, it's a slow road, but we're walking it. And it starts with folks like Yowans willing to meet us halfway, to trust us when it's hard. Without that, we'd be nowhere." The words hit David like a warm tide, washing over him and leaving a glow in their wake. He hadn't expected this, not the camaraderie, not the sense that he, just a kid from Oakwood, could be part of something bigger. But standing there, with the bell ringing sharp and clear behind him, he understood. Change wasn't just the officer's burden, it was everyone's. Step by step, they were building something new together. Later that afternoon, the sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of gold and pink as David pushed through the glass doors of the local coffee shop. The bell above jingled faintly, and the rich scent of roasted beans enveloped him like a hug. He spotted his dad at a corner table, not hunched over a stack of reports like usual, but leaning back in his chair, laughing with a couple of local business owners. Marcus's deep voice rumbled through the cozy space, his broad grin lighting up his face in a way David hadn't seen in months. It was a rare sight, this father unburdened, at ease, the lines of worry smoothed away for once. David slid into the seat across from him, dropping his backpack with a soft thud. "Hey, buddy," Marcus said, his eyes bright as he looked up. "How was school?" David shrugged, a grin tugging at his lips. "Good. I saw Officer Grant and Officer Baker today outside the school, talking to some kids." Marcus's brow lifted, curiosity flickering across his face. "Oh, what was that about?" David leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table, a quiet pride swelling in his chest. They were really talking, not just giving orders, but listening. "It felt different, Dad, like they're part of us, not just the police." Marcus leaned back, a slow nod tilting his head as a thoughtful shadow crossed his features. "That's exactly what we need," he said, his voice soft but firm. "It's not about badges or titles, it's about being people, all of us, just trying to do right by each other." David saw the glint of pride in his father's eyes, a mirror to the hope he'd felt earlier. Marcus had fought for Thistbush against resistance, wrestled with his own doubts to bring Oakwood to this point. But it wasn't just him. It was the shop owners swapping stories over coffee, the kids chattering with officers, the neighbors who'd started waving instead of whispering. They were all in it together, stitching the town back together one thread at a time. As the weeks rolled on, the changes in Oakwood deepened, taking root in the everyday rhythms of life. David felt it on his walks home, saw it in the way Mrs. Larson from down the street lingered to chat with Officer Baker about her garden, her usual sharpness softened by a tentative trust. He heard it in the laughter that spilled from porches, free of the old undercurrent of tension. The officers weren't just shadows in patrol cars anymore, they were faces, names, people who stopped to ask how your day was going. And for David, it wasn't just about his dad's badge or the promises he'd made. It was about the collective heartbeat of Oakwood, the shared resolve to mend what had been broken, to build a place where safety wasn't a privilege, but a right. But the story of Oakwood wasn't one of sudden triumph or fairy tale endings. It was grittier, real-era tapestry woven from the threads of human imperfection. People had faced their failures, owned them, and chosen to move forward together. Trust wasn't rebuilt in a day. It grew slowly, nurtured by open hearts and honest words. Justice, David realized, wasn't just about punishment or power, it was about accountability. about ensuring no one's voice was drowned out by arrogance or abuse. The officers who'd once wielded authority like a weapon were learning to lay it down, to listen instead of dictate. And the community, once fractured by suspicion, was learning to hold them to that standard not out of vengeance, but out of a shared hunger for something better. Across town, on a night that carried the faint chill of early spring, Mayor John Carter stepped into the upscale restaurant on Main Street, his shoulders squared beneath his tailored coat. At 50, he was a man who'd spent decades carving a path through a world that often tried to shove him. A city a black man who'd just taken office, determined to lead Oakwood with the dignity it deserved. He'd chosen this dinner as a quiet celebration, a moment to breathe after the whirlwind of his campaign. The clink of crystal glasses and a murmur of polished voices filled the air. As he settled at a corner table, the flickering candlelight casting soft shadows across his face. For a fleeting moment, he felt at peace. That peace shattered when a waiter, a weary man with a pinched mouth and eyes, that darted to quickly approached his table. The man's tone was clipped, his words laced with a disdain he didn't bother to hide as he muttered something about keeping the place presentable. John's jaw tightened, his fingers curling around the edge of the menu as decades of quiet resilience flared into a slow-burning anger. He'd faced this buffer too many times, but here, in his own town, it stung deeper. Before he could respond, the door swung open and a police officer strode in, his boots heavy on the polished floor. The officer's hand rested on his holster, his gaze locking onto John with a coldness that made the room feel smaller. "Sir, we got a call about a disturbance," the officer said, his voice flat, though his eyes told a different story, one of assumption, of power flexed without question. John's heart thudded, not with fear, but with a weary fury. He stood, his movements deliberate, his voice steady as he said, "I'm the mayor. I'm here for dinner, not trouble." The officer blinked, uncertainty flickering across his face, but the waiter smirked, folding his arms as if to say he'd won some unspoken victory. The confrontation stretched taut, a tableau of injustice laid bare in the soft glow of the dining room. Word of the incident spread like wildfire, reaching David the next morning as he laced up his shoes for school. His stomach churned as he pictured Mayor Carter proud, steadfast, humiliated in a place meant for respite. It was a stark reminder that Oakwood's progress wasn't a straight line. Power, when abused, could still wound deeply, could still silence voices that deserved to be heard. But it also lit a fire under the community. That evening, Marcus gathered the officers at the station, his voice low and fierce as he laid out new training mandatory sessions on de-escalation, on recognizing bias, on remembering who they served. Officer Grant nodded grimly, his usual warmth tempered by resolve, while Officer Baker scribbled notes, his brow furrowed with focus. David watched it all unfold, his young heart grappling with the weight of it. Justice wasn't a gift handed down, it was a promise fought for, a balance restored when people refused to look away. The lesson sank deep. Power unchecked was a poison, but power tempered by listening, by accountability, could heal. Oakwood wasn't done growing it by a long shot, but its people were awake now, ready to hold each other up, to demand better, to keep stepping forward together. And David, with his quiet hope and steady gaze, knew he'd be part of it every messy, beautiful step of the way. John Carter had only been the mayor of Ashton for a short while, a sprawling, vibrant city pulsing with life and diversity, yet shadowed by the lingering stains of racism that refused to fade. Tall, with a cascade of dark hair framing his face, John carried himself with an easy grace, his warm smile a beacon of kindness. To those who knew him, he was a steady hand and turbulent Watersa leader who didn't just preach about equality, but lived it, his gentle demeanor masking a fierce resolve. He'd fought tooth and nail during the election, his voice rising above the noise with promises of progress for all, no matter their skin color or station in life. His victory wasn't just a triumph of charisma or clever policies, it was a testament to his grit, forged in the fires of a childhood spent clawing his way up from a poor, working-class family. Prejudice had been a constant shadow, but John had never let it define him. Even now, with the weight of a city on his shoulders, he clung to the humility that kept him grounded. his life a quiet rebellion against the trappings of power. After a grueling week of endless meetings, his calendar a chaotic tapestry of obligations, John felt the ache of exhaustion settle into his bones. He craved a moment of solitude, a sliver of normalcy away from the relentless gaze of the public. Without a word to anyone, he slipped away to La Bella Vita, a luxurious restaurant nestled in the heart of Ashton's bustling downtown. It was a place he'd never ventured into before, its reputation woven with tales of decadent dishes and an ambience that whispered extravagance. Tonight, he didn't want to be Mayor Carter, the man with a target on his back and a mission in his heart. He just wanted to be John, a man savoring a meal, chasing a fleeting peace beneath the soft glow of chandelier light. The moment he stepped into La Bella Vita, the world seemed to shift. The air was thick with the scent of roasted herbs and aged wine, the space a symphony of elegance. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen stars, casting golden light across tables adorned with delicate glassware that shimmered in their glow. A pianist's fingers danced over the keys in a corner, the notes rippling through the room like a gentle stream, soothing the edges of John's frayed nerves. Paintings adorned the walls, bold strokes of color, framed in gold, while vases of fresh lilies lent a tender sweetness to the air. It was a sanctuary, a fleeting escape from the chaos of the city beyond those polished doors. John, dressed in a dark suit that blended into the shadows, moved with purpose toward a small table tucked into a quiet corner. He offered polite smiles to the few diners who glanced his way, their nods and faint grins a small comfort. But not every gaze was kind. Near his chosen spot, a group of four sat at a larger table, well-dressed, their wealth dripping from the sparkle of jewelry and the crisp lines of tailored suits. They were white, their faces etched with the casual arrogance of privilege, and they noticed John the instant he crossed their line of sight. At first, it was just a flicker, a quick glance that might have been curiosity. But soon, their stares hardened into something colder, more deliberate. The oldest woman in the group, her blonde curls meticulously sculpted and her neck draped in diamonds, arched a brow as though John's presence offended her very existence. She leaned toward the man beside her, a stocky figure with a ruddy complexion, and murmured something under her breath. His head swiveled, his eyes locking onto John with unabashed disdain. The other two, a younger man with a smug grin, and a woman whose laughter tinkled like breaking glass, joined in, their whispers weaving a web of mockery. John didn't need to hear their words to feel the venom. He'd known those looks his whole life. They were the stares of people who saw his black skin and decided he didn't belong not here, not anywhere they claimed as their own. He settled into his chair, the leather creaking softly beneath him, and unfolded the menu with deliberate calm. But the weight of their scrutiny pressed against him, a silent storm he couldn't ignore. From the corner of his eye, he caught fragments of their disdain. "Who does he think he is?" The older woman's voice was a sharp hiss, loud enough to slice through the piano's melody. "Must have wandered into the wrong place," the ruddy-faced man sneered, his tone dripping with sarcasm. A ripple of anger stirred in John's chest, mingling with the familiar sting of frustration. How many times had he swallowed these feelings, buried them deep to keep moving forward? He'd come here to unwind, not to fight. And so he drew a slow, steadying breath, willing himself to focus on the promise of a good meal. The waiter approached a young man named Kevin, his smile bright and practiced as he scribbled John's order, a medium-rare steak, a glass of red wine, and a bottle of water. "Very good, sir," Kevin said with a nod before vanishing into the hum of the restaurant. John let himself relax, if only for a moment, the tension easing from his shoulders. But the reprieve was short-lived. The whispers from the nearby table grew bolder, their voices rising like a tide. "This is outrageous," the blonde woman declared, her tone sharp enough to cut. "Are there no standards here anymore?" John's jaw tightened, his fingers curling around the edge of the table. He wanted to turn, to meet their eyes and demand what gave them the right to judge him. But he didn't, not here, not now. The pain wasn't just in their words, it was the isolation they summoned. The reminder that no matter how high he climbed, to some, he'd always be an outsider. A memory flickered to life, unbidden and vivid. He was 10, standing beside his mother in a corner store in a white neighborhood, the summer sun baking the pavement outside. They'd gone for ice cream, a simple treat to break the monotony of a sweltering day. The clerk, a weary man with a pinched forehead, stared down at them, his lips curling as he spat. Find somewhere more suitable. John's mother hadn't argued. She'd taken his small hand in hers, her grip firm but trembling, and led him out into the heat. Later, under the dim light of their kitchen, she'd knelt before him, her voice soft but steady. You can't change how people think, John, but you can choose how you carry yourself through it. Those words echoed in his mind now, a lifeline amid the storm. He lifted his glass of water, the coolness grounding him as he took a sip, determined to let the night unfold on his terms. But the hostility didn't relent. The group's stares bore into him, their whispers a constant hum beneath the music. John tried to push it aside, reminding himself their discomfort wasn't his burden to bear. He'd faced worse and emerged stronger, yet he couldn't have foreseen how their prejudice would ripple beyond their table, tainting even the simple act of being served. Kevin had greeted him warmly enough at first, his demeanor crisp and professional. But as the minutes ticked by, John noticed a shift. Kevin lingered at the nearby table, chatting with the group as the blonde woman leaned in, her lips moving quickly. The others laughed, a sound that grated against John's ears. Kevin's eyes flicked toward him, a fleeting glance that carried something unspoken, before he nodded and turned away. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Round him, other tables received their appetizer, steaming bowls of soup. Glistening plates of brush. A while his remained bare. John told himself it was nothing, that a busy kitchen could falter. But when Kevin finally returned, he set down a Caesar salad instead of the seafood chowder John had ordered. Sorry, John said, his voice even. I think I asked for the soup. Kevin shrugged, his smile gone. Oh, must have been a mix-up. I'll check. He didn't hurry to the kitchen, though. Instead, he drifted to the white diner's table, refilling their wine with a grin that never reached John's corner. When the chowder arrived, it was cold, the broth congealing in the bowl. Kevin dropped it off without a word, his eyes avoiding John's as he retreated. John exhaled, forcing himself to let it go. He sipped the soup, the chill of it mirroring the growing frost in his chest. But the final blow came with the main course. The steak, supposed to be medium rare, juicy, and tender, was a slab of overcooked meat, dry and unyielding beneath his knife. This time, he couldn't stay silent. He flagged Kevin down, his voice still measured. This isn't what I ordered. Kevin barely glanced at the plate, his tone flat. I'll see what I can do. He didn't move, though, hovering near the other table as though tethered there. In that moment, the lesson of justice burned brighter than ever in John's mind. Power, wielded carelessly, could corrupt even the smallest interaction, stirring a waiter's indifference into a mirror of the diner's disdain. The consequences of such abuse weren't just personal. They rippled outward, eroding trust, dignity, and the hope of a better world. John sat back, the weight of his mother's words mingling with a resolve forged anew. He wouldn't let their pettiness define him, but he wouldn't forget either. The air inside the restaurant felt heavy, thick with the scent of grilled meat and the faint hum of murmured conversations. John sat at his table, the crisp white tablecloth beneath his hands slightly wrinkled from where he'd rested them too long. He'd ordered his steak medium rare, his voice steady and polite when he'd made the request. But now, as he stared at the plate before him, a flicker of disappointment stirred in his chest. The meat was overcooked, its edges too dark, the pink center he'd envisioned nowhere to be found. He took a slow breath, steadying himself, and raised his hand to catch the waiter's attention. Kevin, the waiter, approached with a slouch that seemed to carry the weight of a long shift. His sigh was loud, unapologetic, slicing through the quiet chatter of the dining room. He barely glanced at John before fixing his eyes on the steak, his lips curling into a faint grimace. This is what the kitchen sent out, he muttered, his tone sharp with irritation. As if John's request was a personal affront, he shrugged, his shoulders lifting in a lazy arc. If you don't like it, I can take it back, but don't expect a new one anytime soon. They're slow as hell back there. John's jaw tightened, but his expression remained calm, a mask of patience honed over years of navigating life's small injustices. I'm not in a hurry, he said evenly, his voice low but firm. I just want it prepared the way I asked, that's all. His eyes met Kevin's, searching for a flicker of understanding, but found only defiance staring back. Kevin shook his head, a quick, dismissive jerk, and snatched the plate from the table without another word. His footsteps echoed faintly as he disappeared into the bustle of the kitchen, leaving John to sit in the lingering silence. The wait that followed stretched on far longer than it should have, each passing minute amplifying the faint ache of hunger in John's stomach. Around him, the clink of cutlery and the soft laughter of other diners filled the space, but his table felt like an island adrift in the room's currents. When Kevin finally returned, the plate hit the table with a thud, the force of it sending John's glass of water trembling, a ripple dancing across its surface. The waiter didn't pause to acknowledge the near spill, didn't offer a word of apology. He simply turned on his heel and stalked off, his back a wall of indifference. John watched him go, a quiet frustration simmering beneath his composed exterior. He raised his hand again, this time to request a fresh bottle of water. His throat was dry, the meal incomplete without it, but Kevin didn't even glance his way. Several attempts later, after waving with increasing persistence, the waiter finally trudged back, his reluctance palpable in every step. "What else do you need?" Kevin's voice was ice. His eyes narrowed as if John's mere presence was an imposition. The disrespect hung between them, sharp and unmistakable, but John refused to let it rattle him. "A bottle of water," he replied, his tone steady, like I asked earlier. Kevin gave a curt nod, but the water didn't appear until John had nearly finished his steak, the meal now a muted satisfaction overshadowed by the waiter's attitude. When it finally arrived, Kevin set the bottle down with a sharp exhale, as if the task had pushed him to the edge of his endurance. John felt the tension radiating from Kevin's every movement, a coiled energy that seemed to pulse with something deeper than mere annoyance. His gaze drifted briefly to a nearby table, where a group of diners well-dressed, their voices carrying a casual arrogance, whispered among themselves. Their eyes flicked toward John, then away, their murmurs a quiet chorus of judgment. It dawned on him then, Kevin's behavior wasn't random. It was a performance, fueled by the unspoken approval of those onlookers, a subtle flex of power in a space where he felt emboldened to wield it. Enough was enough. John believed in fairness, in the power of words over anger. He straightened in his chair, his resolve hardening. "Excuse me," he said, his voice cutting through the hum of the restaurant. "Could you please call the manager over?" Kevin, standing a few feet away with a tray of drinks balanced in his hands, froze. His face shifted, the cold indifference giving way to a flash of irritation. He set the tray down on a nearby table with a deliberate clatter and approached John, arms crossed tightly over his chest. His stance was rigid, his eyes glinting with defiance. "Manager for what?" Kevin's voice trailed off, dripping with sarcasm, as if the request was absurd. John met his gaze, unflinching. "I'd like to discuss my experience here," he said calmly. "I think it could help improve things for everyone." But Kevin didn't soften. Instead, he smirked, his lips twisting into a pout. "Look, I'm just doing my job. If you're not happy, maybe this place isn't for you." His words carried a sting, loud enough to draw the attention of nearby tables. Heads turned, eyes lingered, and the whispers from the group of onlookers grew louder, their amusement palpable. John's pulse quickened, but he kept his voice steady, firmer now. "I'm not trying to make a scene. I just want to speak to the manager. It's a simple request." Kevin's response was a bitter laugh, sharp and theatrical, echoing through the room. "You're the one causing trouble," he shot back, his tone accusing. "You're disturbing everyone else." The words hit John like a slap, the absurdity of the claim twisting something deep inside him. How could a polite request spiral into this? He straightened further, his eyes locking with Kevin's. "I'm not the one causing trouble," he said, his voice low but resolute. "I just want to address a service issue with the manager." Kevin didn't budge. Instead, he turned toward the group of whispering diners, raising his voice for their benefit. "Excuse me, gentlemen," he called out. "This guest seems unhappy and is making a ruckus." "I'll handle it." Laughter erupted from the table, one of them muttering, "I knew it, just here to stir up trouble." The air grew thick with tension, their words a quiet venom that stung John's ears. He felt the weight of their stares, the judgment seeping into the space around him. But he wouldn't falter. "So you're refusing to get the manager?" he asked, his voice a quiet blade. Kevin's smirk widened, his sarcasm cutting deeper. "I don't think management needs to waste their time on this, but if you insist, I'll see what they say." "Don't expect much." With a snort, he turned away, leaving John to sit in the wake of his defiance. Inside, John's mind churned. He'd faced moments like this before, small abuses of power, petty cruelties masked as authority, and each time, he'd chosen composure over confrontation. But this was different. The stakes felt higher, the lesson sharper. Justice wasn't just about fairness. It was about holding those who wielded even the smallest scraps of power accountable for how they used it. He leaned back in his chair, his calm exterior belying the fire building within him. He'd wait. He'd see this through. The restaurant buzzed around him, the tension now a living thing. Curious glances darted his way, the whispers growing bolder. At a nearby table, a man rose to his feet, a police officer, his uniform crisp, his badge catching the light. He was tall, in his 40s, with a stern face carved from years of authority. His steps were slow, deliberate. As he approached John's table, arms crossed, his presence looming. "Excuse me," the officer said, his voice deep and commanding. "What's going on here?" John looked up, meeting the man's gaze with the same unshaken calm. "It's nothing serious, officer," he replied, polite but firm. "I just asked to speak to the manager about a service issue." The officer's eyes narrowed, unyielding, and he glanced toward Kevin as if seeking a second opinion. Kevin seized the moment, stepping forward with a gleam of triumph in his eyes. "Officer, this man's been bothering other customers, making unreasonable demands. I tried to handle it, but he won't cooperate." The officer nodded slightly, as if the story confirmed some unspoken assumption. He turned back to John, his gaze hardening. "Sir, if you're causing trouble, I'll need to see your identification." John's breath caught, a surge of disbelief rising within him. "I don't think that's necessary," he said, his voice soft but steady. "I haven't done anything wrong. There's no reason for this." The officer's frown deepened, his tone growing sharper. "Listen, I don't want to escalate this, but I have the right to ask for ID in a public place if there's a problem. If you don't cooperate, I'll have to treat you as a troublemaker." The words echoed through the restaurant, drawing every eye. The group of diners nearby smirked, one whispering, "I knew something was up." John felt the injustice like a weight on his chest, but he held the officer's stare. "I'm not causing trouble," he said, his voice unwavering. "I'm asking to be treated fairly, like anyone else here, with all due respect. I don't need to prove myself when I've done nothing wrong." The officer stepped closer, leaning down, his voice a low growl. "Show me your ID, now, or I'll take action." John's mind raced, a storm of thoughts beneath his calm facade. He wasn't just any customer, was the newly elected mayor of this city. A fact he'd kept quiet tonight. But this wasn't about titles, it was about principle. He took a deep breath, his resolve steel. "Officer," he said, "I won't." The room held its breath, the clash of wills a silent thunder. For John, this was more than a meal gone wrong. It was a stand against the petty tyrannies that festered. Unchecked, a lesson in the cost of power misused. And as the officer's face darkened, John knew the consequences were only beginning to unfold. The air inside the quaint La Bella Vita restaurant buzzed with the low hum of conversation and the clinking of silverware against plates. A typical evening unfolding in the dim glow of pendant lights. John sat alone at his table near the window, his posture relaxed yet dignified, savoring the warmth of his coffee as it traced a comforting path down his throat. The world outside blurred into streaks of headlights and neon signs, but within these walls, time seemed to slow until the heavy footsteps of the police officer shattered that fragile peace. The officer loomed over John's table, his shadow stretching across the checkered tablecloth like a storm cloud eclipsing the sun. His voice, sharp and commanding, cut through the ambient noise. "Show me your papers." John's hand paused mid-motion, the coffee cup hovering just shy of his lips. He lowered it slowly, deliberately, the porcelain clinking softly against the saucer as his dark eyes lifted to meet the officer's glare. Inside, a flicker of indignation sparked, but his face remained a mask of composure. I'm under no obligation to do that, he said, his tone steady. Each word weighted with quiet conviction. If you believe I've done something illegal, show me your evidence. Otherwise, I demand you stop this immediately. His voice didn't waver, but beneath it simmered a deep resolve, forged from years of standing against storms far fiercer than this one. The officer recoiled as if slapped, his boots scuffing the hardwood floor. For a fleeting moment, confusion clouded his features, brow furrowed. His lips parted slightly as though searching for a retort that wouldn't come. But then the confusion gave way to something uglier. His jaw tightened, and his eyes narrowed into slits of rage. Who do you think you are, refusing my orders? He bellowed, his voice booming across the restaurant like a thunderclap. Heads turned, forks stilled, and the murmur of the diners dissolved into a stunned hush. The officer's outburst wasn't just a challenge, it was a performance. A flex of power meant to cow John into submission. But John didn't flinch. He straightened in his chair, his spine rigid with purpose, his gaze blazing with a fierce, unyielding light. I'm a citizen, same as everyone here, he replied, his words ringing clear and true. And I won't be treated like less because of the color of my skin. The restaurant seemed to hold its breath. The silence was thick, oppressive, pressing down on every soul in the room. Diners exchanged furtive glances, their eyes darting between John and the officer, who stood frozen, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles gleamed white under the dim lights. The man's mind churned, could feel the weight of every stare, the unspoken judgment hanging in the air. Should he push harder, assert his dominance, or back off and risk looking weak? His chest heaved with indecision, his pride warring with the faint whisper of doubt creeping into his thoughts. John, sensing the shift, reached into his pocket with deliberate calm and pulled out his phone. The officer's frown deepened, his thick brows knitting together as suspicion flared. If you'd like, John said, his voice smooth as polished stone, I can call someone who'll explain this to you more clearly. Before the officer could process the implication, John's thumb was already gliding across the screen, dialing a number with practiced ease. The atmosphere in the restaurant thickened, the tension coiling tighter with every passing second. What had been a simmering standoff now felt like a pressure cooker on the verge of bursting. The officer's patience snapped. Who do you think you are to defy me? He roared, his voice shrill and jagged, slicing through the stillness. His face flushed a deep crimson, veins bulging at his temples as he leaned forward, his bulk casting an even darker shadow over John's table. The diners flinched, some clutching their napkins tighter, others fumbling for their phones to capture the escalating drama. Whispers rippled through the crowd like wind through dry leaves. He's recording it. What's he doing? But the officer was oblivious, consumed by his own fury. Put that phone down right now, he barked, jabbing a finger toward John. That's an order. John lifted his head slowly, his eyes locking onto the officer's with an unshakable calm. I haven't broken any law, he said, his voice low but firm, cutting through the chaos like a blade. I have every right to make this call. You need to calm down, officer. Those words were a match tossed into gasoline. The officer's face twisted into a mask of rage, his hand shooting up to point directly at John, trembling with barely contained violence. Don't you dare tell me how to do my job, he shouted, his voice so loud it rattled the glassware on nearby tables. I've warned you, you've got no right to resist me. The restaurant fell into a deathly stillness, the air so heavy it felt like it could crush bone. Diners sat paralyzed, their breaths shallow, eyes wide with a mix of fear and fascination. No one moved, no one spoke, not even the waiter, Kevin, who lingered near the counter, his youthful face pale and uncertain, his hands twisting nervously in his apron. He'd been the one to call the officer over, muttering something about John looking suspicious, and now regret gnawed at him, his stomach churning as he watched the scene spiral beyond his control. At a table nearby, a group of white diners smirked, their expressions dripping with smug satisfaction. One of them, a man with a slick comb-over and a too-tight collared shirt, leaned back in his chair and muttered, just loud enough for others to hear, "Stubborn fool. Thinks he's above us all, but he'll learn his place soon enough." His companions chuckled softly, their eyes glinting with malice. as if this confrontation were a twisted form of entertainment they'd paid to see. The officer took a menacing step closer, his boots thudding against the floor, his broad frame looming over John's table. He bent down, his face mere inches from John's, his breath hot and ragged. "Listen, buddy," he snarled, his voice a venomous hiss. "This is your last warning. Put that damn phone down and show me your papers, or I'll make you regret it." John didn't blink. He set the phone gently on the table, his movements slow and deliberate, then met the officer's gaze head-on. "I've done nothing wrong," he said, his voice a quiet thunder, "and I won't bow to your baseless threats." That was the final threat of the officer's restraint snapped. "All right, then," he roared, his voice echoing off the walls. In a blur of motion, he yanked the gun from his holster, the metal glinting ominously under the restaurant's lights as he leveled it at John's chest. The room erupted into chaos. Screams pierced the air. "Oh my God, what's he doing?" as diners scrambled back, chairs screeching against the floor. A woman near the window clapped a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with terror, while a man bolted for the exit, his coat flapping behind him like wings. John didn't move. He sat there, statue still, his face a portrait of defiance and serenity, his eyes never leaving the officers. The gun trembled in the man's hands, his bravado faltering under the weight of John's unflinching resolve. "Get up," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "I won't say it again." John's response was soft, almost gentle, but it carried the force of a tidal wave. "You're wrong to do this," he said. "You have no right to threaten my life over an unjust demand." His words hung in the air, a quiet rebuke that seemed to strip the officer bare, exposing the fragility beneath his bluster. The diners watched, transfixed. Some admired John's courage, their hearts swelling with a mix of awe and dread. Others whispered prayers under their breath, fearing the moment the gun might roar. Kevin, the waiter, stumbled back a step, his hands trembling as he clutched the edge of the counter. Guilt twisted his youth. Hadn't meant for this, hadn't wanted it to go so far. His eyes flickered between John and the officer, searching for a way out. But he was too afraid to act, too small in the face of this storm. The officer's resolve wavered. His hands shook harder, sweat beading on his forehead as John's calm unraveled him. He'd expected fear, compliance, anything but this quiet, unshakable strength that made him feel like the weaker man. His ego screamed for him to double down, to prove his power, but doubt gnawed at him, a cold whisper asking if he'd gone too far. The tension stretched taut, a bowstring ready to snap every second in eternity. John reached for his phone again, his movements slow and deliberate, as if daring the officer to act. He dialed a number, pressed the device to his ear, and waited, his gaze still locked on the man before him. The restaurant held its breath, the silence punctuated only by the faint ringing on the line. Then John spoke, his voice steady and commanding. "Hello, this is John Carter, mayor of this city. I need you at La Bella Vita right now. There's an officer abusing his authority, and it's getting dangerous." The words hit like a shockwave. The officer's gun wavered, his eyes widening as disbelief crashed over him. "Mayor," he muttered, the word tumbling from his lips like a stone. The diners gasped, their whispers erupting into a frantic buzz. "The mayor, him?" As heads swiveled toward John, seeing him anew, the smug group at the nearby table faltered, their smirks fading into unease. The man with the comb-over shrinking back in his seat. The officer's world tilted. His gun still hovered in the air, but his confidence had crumbled, replaced by a creeping panic. He'd thought John was just another man he could bully, another name he could erase with a badge and a shout. Now, the weight of his actions pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. John continued his call, unruffled. "He's threatening me," he said to the sheriff on the line, his tone even but urgent. "If we don't act now, this will spiral further. I need you here immediately." He hung up, setting the phone down with a soft clack, his eyes never leaving the officers. The man stood there, gun in hand, his bravado reduced to ashes. His mind raced. How had he misjudged so badly? Could he still salvage this? Or had he crossed a line he couldn't uncross? Kevin, watching from the sidelines, felt his knees weaken. The truth dawned on him, on everyone. The man they'd dismissed, the man they'd judged, held power they couldn't fathom. The restaurant buzzed with a new energy, a mix of shock and reverence. As diners exchanged wide-eyed glances, some slipped out the door, unwilling to be tangled in the fallout. But those who stayed couldn't tear their eyes from John. In that moment, the scene crystallized a raw truth. Justice wasn't just a word, it was a force, alive in John's unwavering stand. The officer's abuse of power had unraveled before their eyes, a stark reminder that authority unchecked could twist into tyranny. And as the distant wail of sirens grew closer, the lesson sank deeper. Consequences awaited, not just for the officer, but for anyone who dared to wield power without righteousness. John sat there, calm as ever, a beacon of integrity in a world too quick to bend. His quiet strength a testament to the enduring fight for what was fair and true. The air in the restaurant buzzed with a restless energy, a mixture of curiosity and unease rippling through the crowd of onlookers, as they watched something unfold that none of them had anticipated. John Carter, the city's mayor, stood at the center of it all, his silence louder than any shout. His eyes locked onto the young policeman's, glinting with a defiance that seemed to pierce through the dim light of the room. It wasn't just a look, it was a declaration, etched into the lines of his face, that he would not bend, not even an inch, to the weight of injustice pressing down on him. The people around him, ordinary diners caught in this unexpected drama, felt their surprise morph into something deeper, a growing respect for the man who refused to cower. John's heart beat steadily, though beneath his calm exterior, a storm of emotions churned. He wasn't just standing there for himself. He was standing for every person who'd ever felt the sting of power wielded carelessly. The policeman, Officer Chris, shifted uneasily, his grip on his gun tightening for a moment before loosening, as if he wasn't sure whether to double down or back away. His youthful face, flushed with a mix of arrogance and uncertainty, betrayed him. He'd expected John to shrink, to comply, to let the moment pass without a fight. But John's unyielding gaze told a different story, and it sent a shiver of doubt through Chris's spine. 10 minutes earlier, John had made a call, his voice low but steady as he dialed a number he knew by heart. Now, the restaurant's glass door swung open with a sharp creak, and Chief David Lawson stepped inside. The overhead lights cast harsh shadows across his face, accentuating the hard set of his jaw and the fire in his eyes. Normally, David was a man of unshakable calm, a steady hand in any crisis. But seeing John, his friend of decades, his brother through thick and thin, treated like this, it lit a fuse inside him. His boots thudded against the tiled floor as he crossed the threshold, every step deliberate, every movement radiating purpose. The chatter in the room faded to a hush, all eyes turned to him, drawn by the gravity he carried. David and John weren't just colleagues, they were forged in the fires of shared struggles. From their scrappy youth to the bruising battles of John's election campaign, David had been there, a rock when the ground beneath John trembled. So when his phone buzzed with John's call, David hadn't hesitated. He dropped everything, the urgency in his friend's voice pulling him across town like a magnet. Now, standing in the restaurant, he took in the scene with a single sweep of his gaze. John, resolute and unshaken, Chris, clutching his weapon like a lifeline, the diners, frozen in their seats, forks hovering midair. The tension was a living thing, thick and suffocating, curling around every table and chair. David's chest tightened with a mix of worry and rage as he approached John. He reached out, his hand clasping John's in a grip that spoke of years of trust. Then he turned to Chris, his expression hardening into something unforgiving. "What's going on here, Chris?" His voice was a low rumble, calm on the surface but edged with a steel that made the young officer flinch. David could smell the abuse of power in the air, sharp and bitter, and it turned his stomach. Chris tried to hold his ground, his lips parting to offer some flimsy excuse. "I was just doing my job," he muttered, but the words sounded hollow, even to his own ears. His eyes darted around, searching for an escape that didn't exist. He'd refused to show his badge earlier, banking on intimidation to carry him through. But now, under David's piercing stare, that bravado crumbled. David didn't waver. He turned to John, his voice softening just enough to let his concern show. "John, can you tell me what happened?" John exhaled slowly, his composure a shield against the chaos. He began to recount the evening, his words measured but vivid, painting a picture of every slight, every threat. When he reached the moment where Chris had drawn his gun, a collective gasp rippled through the restaurant. Diners clutched their napkins tighter, their faces darkening with anger. David's own expression grew grimmer, his lips pressing into a thin line as he turned back to Chris. Disappointment radiated from him, heavy and palpable. "Chris," he said, his tone stripped of patience, "you're forgetting something critical. You're a police officer. Your duty is to protect and serve, not to terrorize citizens. And you pointed a gun at the mayor, you absolute fool." Chris's head dipped, his shoulders slumping under the weight of David's words. He felt the truth of them like a punch to the gut, each syllable stripping away the thin veneer of justification he'd clung to. But even then, he couldn't muster the courage to own up to it. He just stood there, mute and shrinking, as the reality of his mistake sank in. David wasn't about to let this linger. "Chris, you're suspended. Effective immediately," he declared, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. There was no room for debate, no crack for argument to slip through. Chris stepped back, his hands falling limp at his sides. He knew he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. With a sharp wave of his hand, David signaled Chris to leave. "Go back to your office. We'll deal with you later." As Chris shuffled out, head bowed, David turned to the cluster of diners nearby. His voice rose, firm and resonant. "Let this be a lesson to respect others, no matter who they are." The words hung in the air, a warning and a promise. Then his gaze shifted to the restaurant manager, a middle-aged man who'd been hovering on the sidelines, wringing his hands. The manager's face paled under David's scrutiny. He'd seen it all: waiters' insolence, the escalation, and done nothing. Now, the reckoning was here. David didn't mince words. "I demand you fire that waiter, right now." His tone was ice cold, leaving no doubt that he meant every syllable. The manager's eyes flicked to Kevin, the waiter in question, who stood frozen a few feet away. Kevin's face was a mask of shock, his mouth open as if he wanted to protest but couldn't find the words. The manager hesitated, his mind racing for a way out, but David's stare pinned him in place. Finally, he turned to Kevin, his voice trembling as he forced the words out. "Kevin, I'm sorry, but you're done. Your behavior went too far." Kevin's head dropped, shame flooding through him. He didn't argue. He just stood there, a defeated figure in the middle of the wreckage he'd helped create. David turned back to John, resting a hand on his shoulder. "I'm sorry you went through this, John. I'll make sure it's handled right." John nodded, a quiet satisfaction settling over him. The storm had passed, and justice had prevailed, at least for tonight. But as the tension drained from the room, the echoes of what had happened lingered, a ripple that would spread far beyond these walls. In the days that followed, the incident at the restaurant refused to fade into the background. It grew, swelling into something larger, a story that gripped the city. For John, it wasn't just a personal victory, it became a defining moment, a testament to his resolve as mayor. The media latched onto it, headlines screaming about racism and power gone unchecked. Chief David Lawson stood before a sea of cameras, his face stern as he announced Chris's suspension. "That kind of behavior has no place in our force," he said, his words clipped and final. The news raced through the city, igniting debates in coffee shops and living rooms alike. Support poured in for John from every corner: human rights groups, community leaders, everyday citizens. Letters and calls flooded his office, voices praising his grace under fire. "You showed them what strength looks like," one message read, and John felt the weight of those words settle into his bones. Meanwhile, David dug deeper. The investigation into Chris stretched beyond that single night, unearthing a pattern of arrogance and unprofessionalism that had festered unnoticed. In the end, David made the call. Chris was out, fired. It was a bold move, a line in the sand against corruption and prejudice. The decision reverberated, a warning to anyone who thought they could wield power without consequence. Back at the restaurant, the manager didn't waste time. He called an emergency meeting. His staff gathered in a tight circle as he laid bare the lesson they couldn't ignore. Respect wasn't optional. He admitted his own failure, his voice cracking as he spoke of the damage to their reputation. Training followed, hordes of lessons on fairness, on dignity, on rebuilding what they'd lost. The restaurant vowed to change, to become a place where everyone felt safe. And in the broader community, the incident sparked a reckoning. People really talk heat about the insidious ways racism and power tangled together, about the need to root it out wherever it hid. What happened that night wasn't just a clash in a restaurant. It was a mirror held up to society, reflecting the cost of arrogance and the power of standing firm. For John, for David, for the city, it was a lesson carved in stone. Justice wasn't a gift, it was a fight. And when power overstepped, the consequences would be swift and unrelenting. In a world where power often overshadows morality, one man's unwavering resolve carved a path toward justice that rippled far beyond his own life. John Carter stood at the heart of a storm, a man battered by circumstance yet unyielding in spirit. He wasn't just a victim of the cruelties inflicted upon him. He was a quiet force, a testament to patience stretched thin but never broken. Inside him churned a tumult of emotions, anger at the disrespect he'd endured, sorrow for the countless others who'd suffered in silence, and a burning determination to right the wrongs that had festered too long. Where others might have crumbled under the weight of despair, John found clarity. He refused to let the injustice define him, choosing instead to wield it as a weapon for change. The incident that thrust John into this crucible wasn't a fleeting moment of outrage, it was a slow, suffocating buildup of indignities. Picture a small town, its streets lined with weathered homes and whispering trees, where the air carried the faint hum of routine. Beneath that calm facade, though, simmered a tension born of unchecked authority. Those in power, figures cloaked in privilege and arrogance, had long trampled over the vulnerable, their actions excused by a society too weary or too afraid to protest. John, with his steady gaze and calloused hands, had seen it all: the sidelong glances of disdain, the muttered slurs, the casual dismissals that chipped away at dignity. But this time, the line had been crossed too far. The violation wasn't just personal. It was a glaring symbol of a deeper rot, one that demanded reckoning. Rather than retreat into the shadows of bitterness, John took a stand. His heart pounded as he weighed his choices, each one heavy with risk. He could feel the eyes of his neighbors, some curious, some skeptical, boring into him as he stepped forward. His voice, though trembling at first, grew firm as he spoke out, not just for himself but for every soul who'd been beaten down by the same oppressive hands. It was a declaration woven with defiance and hope, a message that pierced the stillness. No one, no matter how lofty their perch, could escape the boundaries of right and wrong. Justice wasn't a privilege to be granted, it was a right to be claimed. The consequences of John's courage unfurled like a storm breaking over dry land. For the victims, it was a lifeline, a flicker of possibility that their pain might one day be acknowledged. But for those who'd wielded their authority like a club, it was a reckoning. Men like Sheriff Amos Tatia, a weary figure with a perpetual smirk, and a badge he treated as a crown, found their once untouchable world trembling. Tate had thrived on fear, his sharp eyes glinting with the thrill of control as he bent rules to suit his whims. Now, as John's defiance gathered momentum, Tate's smug grin faltered. Sweat beaded on his brow during late-night pacing in his dimly lit office, the walls closing in as whispers of accountability crept closer. Power, he was learning, came with a price when it was abused. The town itself seemed to shift under the weight of this awakening. The local diner, with its chipped formica tables and the clatter of coffee cups, became a crucible for debate. Old-timers like Mrs. Evelyn Harper, a woman with silver hair and a spine of steel, found her voice anew. She'd spent decades watching injustice fester, her sharp tongue silenced by the fear of reprisal. Now, emboldened by John's example, she leaned across the table, her eyes blazing as she recounted tales of corruption she'd buried deep. "Time's up for the high and mighty," she'd say, her words slicing through the hum of conversation. Around her, younger Fasescades like Tommy Ruiz, barely out of high school but brimming with restless energy, knitted fiercely, their fists clenched with a hunger for change. John's triumph wasn't just his own, it was a victory for every person who'd been dismissed, degraded, or crushed under the heel of power. He'd fought not only to reclaim his own dignity, but to light a beacon for the disregarded. In doing so, he shattered the illusion that some stood above the law or beyond the reach of morality. The lesson was stark and undeniable. In a society that dares to call itself civilized, no one escapes the scales of justice. John became a mirror, reflecting both the ugliness of unchecked power and the beauty of resilience. People began to see the world differently. Power wasn't a free pass, respect wasn't optional, and justice wasn't a distant dream. Word of John's stand spread like wildfire, igniting conversations that had long been smothered. In cramped community halls and bustling city squares, voices rose angry, hopeful, determined. Human rights advocates poured over his story, their pens scratching furiously as they drafted calls to action. Minority communities, weary from years of being unheard, gathered under flickering streetlights, their chants weaving John's name into a rallying cry. Social justice warriors, from grizzled veterans to wide-eyed newcomers, clutched his example like a torch, vowing to push forward. The event wasn't just a spark, it was fuel for a movement, a reminder that the fight for fairness was a marathon, not a sprint. John himself felt the weight of this shift, standing on his porch at dusk, the sky streaked with orange and purple. He let the cool breeze wash over him. His chest tightened with a mix of pride and exhaustion. He knew this wasn't the end, far from it. The road ahead stretched long and treacherous, lined with more battles and more sacrifices. But as he gazed out at the horizon, a quiet certainty settled in his bones. He'd proven something vital. When you rise against those who twist power for their own gain, they don't just stumble, they fall. And when they do, justice, patient and relentless, claims its due. The echoes of his actions lingered, a lesson etched into the fabric of the community. Power, when wielded without conscience, sows its own destruction. Justice, when pursued with unwavering heart, becomes an unstoppable force. John Carter, once just a man among many, had become a symbol, a living testament that standing tall against wrongdoing doesn't just heal the wounded, it reshapes the world.